and happy, hanging on, waiting for the good old Lorebeards to get their beards properly trimmed before they go live, or at least brushed. Quick shout out. Just make sure that you can all hear us clearly.
Yeah, we're good. I can see us where we're supposed to be. So we are
good. So if that's the case and we're all good, I think it's probably time for us to just get started. There's no point in having too much of a delay because Altdorf's just too cool and has too much cool stuff to discuss not to get diving straight in. A little bitty of housekeeping to begin. First, thank you all enormously for all the well wishes. I was indeed exceedingly poorly last week. My face exploded and looked more like the surface of Mars than it did a normal human being. It was all kind of bleh. We didn't need that. Nurgle, get thee hence from my household. And as a small other detail, my garage is now finished. For those of you who are not aware, I'm about to move my office out to my converted garage.
That is exciting.
I can't move in yet because we have to wait for it to be passed. It has to pass all the building regulations. So they've got to agree that they're going to send an inspector and all that sort of nonsense. But once that's done, I move in. I cannot express how excited I am.
I can't express how excited I am.
I am going to be up online and I'm going to be playing games. It's going to freaking rock. Right. So we have a fair bit to get on with. So I'm just going to dive right in if you don't mind, Mr. Loremaster of Sotek.
Take us away.
So I'm going to take a quick drink.
Yeah, this is this one's going to be, boy, man, y'all think we've talked about retcons before. Oh my God.
The city of retcons. There are many different ways that we could start a discussion about Altdorf, the city that has changed and changed and changed. One good way of depicting the city of Altdorf is not to imagine this great pile of old empire buildings, but perhaps just a greater demon of Tzeentch sitting there with his fingers up like so, going, hey, plot consistency, screw you! Because Altdorf is, of all the locations in Warhammer, the one that has vacillated, changed, shifted, been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt according to Games Workshop's needs by far the most of anywhere. It was part of our discussion, indeed what is now a several week discussion, about the city and which versions we were going to present. And we kind of going to fall on yes, we're just going to present Altdorf and see where it lands, because this city has done changed. So, as I often like doing, we're going to take you a little bit back in time. We're going to go flying back to young Andy, a non-bearded version of Andy who had a hairline that was much lower than this hairline. Can you imagine me without a beard? This is when I had hair down to my waist. And I was using Altdorf, the capital of the empire, as a frequent part of my Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 games. Now, the city got detailed to quite some significant degree in the very first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It had been already existent in Warhammer, had been mentioned in White Dwarf, had been mentioned indeed in the Fantasy Battle game, and it had been around here or there in a variety of places. But for the first time, the roleplay game really did tell us what Altdorf was, because they used it in the Enemy Within campaign. Now, for those of you who watched my LAWhammer campaign, you'll know that Altdorf's popped up in that. That's because it popped up in the very original version. And the version of the city that they presented then was, I'll be very quick here because we'll go into more depth later. It was a place that was a typical late medieval, Middle European city with fantasy elements, with a population of around about 15,000 people. This is an interesting number when you will come to see what this city is going to become through the course of different books, through the course of different novels, through the course of different games. It was the capital of the empire, and the empire at this point is a far smaller empire than the empire that we know today, which is the site of 1,000 million mighty battles, of which thousands of soldiers are dying on a daily basis as demons are swiping their way through them, or orcs, or Bretonnians, or whoever else it might be for the army of the weak. Altdorf then changed. And when I say changed, I mean it changed a lot. Because the Altdorf that was presented in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 was a small walled city that sat on the confluence of the River Reich and the River Talabek and had the combined waters flowing out through the westward side of the city. Altdorf needed to change because immediately Games Workshop released a new game called Manowar. Manowar was a game about naval fleets, and the Empire was, without doubt, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the most important factions that they had in their entire oeuvre. All of their work, everyone wanted to play with the Empire, after all, but it didn't have a coastline with a proper fleet already built into the background. So the city got its first major change, and they added the Reichsport. The Reichsport was an enormous lake, miles across, with waters deep enough that an entire fleet of ships, sea-going vessels, could berth there. And the waters between Altdorf, which were way up into the continental mass that is the old world, and down to Marienburg, were patrolled by this great fleet of the Empire, and they could pass through Marienburg, which was an independent state, the wasteland, Marienburg, its own place, and move out into the oceans from there. Because at this point, Games Workshop had no interest at all in adding detail to the northern coasts of the Empire, because that was on the very edges of their map, and they've already established that that was kind of a hinterland. Now, they didn't change the city much beyond that, beyond saying that the Imperial First Fleet, big gigantic navy that it could field, was actually pretty huge, pretty big, with great ships, many of which had hundreds of cannons, and wolf ships, which were designed for going up and down the rivers, because they decided that they had, obviously, a river-going fleet. So they had a whole bunch of oars going along with them, and they were coastal huggers, but also capable of going to sea as well. Most importantly, though, of the scores of ships that they had, they could all berth in the Reichsport. Now, the Reichsport, given the size that they made it, would be big enough to completely dwarf the city of Altdorf itself. Massively so. In that it had to be proper big to handle all of these ships, and also handle ship-going battles. There was a lovely little battle that takes place in the Reichsport when Chaos somehow gets all the way up past Marienburg. Don't ask how. They just did, all right? Gets all the way past, goes up and attacks the Reichsport, and we have ourselves a big old battle at sea for a Manowar battle. Good times. So, that was the first major change. And then everything changed for Warhammer. Now, we've discussed this before in the past when Warhammer shifted from the 3rd edition of the battle game to the 4th edition of the battle game. It moved from the great, almost amorphous, massive rules that were designed to pretty much field any fantasy army that you can imagine, and indeed some historical armies as well. They just renamed them slightly for the Warhammer version of them, and then consolidated it all into this is Warhammer. And they released the good old High Elves, Eltharion, versus Goblins, Grom the Paunch, box set. Boom. And very shortly after, they released the Empire Army List. This was for the 4th edition of Warhammer back in about 1992, at a guess. So in 1992, they changed the description of Altdorf for the first time. And it was no longer just a city of some potentially 15,000 that was sitting on the confluence of a river. It was a city of islands, a city that sat in the center of these great marsh flats. And importantly, a city of islands where the waters that came in flooded out across the flats, and a city of islands, just to say one more time. And I remember at the time us reading this, because by this point, we had a lot of very deep descriptions of Altdorf, most of which had come from the novels of Kim Newman. Kim Newman, who is more commonly known amongst Warhammer fans as Jack Yeovil, had spent a lot of time inside Altdorf, and he had added details like the Street of 100 Taverns, or a Street of 1,000 Taverns, depending upon which version we go with. He had added a lot of detail for the Imperial ruling family. He'd had Karl Franz. He added a son. He added family members. He added a whole host of extra new politics that deeply contradicted in many places, the existing Warhammer Fantasy roleplay lore, but they were cool. So everyone kind of accepted them and went, yeah, that'll do. And The Altdorf that he presented was quite medieval. The fantasy elements were there. I mean, one of the primary characters was a vampire. As we all know, that's something that doesn't really quite fit with modern Warhammer, but they kind of squeezed it in regardless. And this new version came out, and the city was bigger. It was a little bit more close to what it was going to become, because this extract gets copied and pasted multiple times with a slight edit throughout the course of the later editions. And loosely speaking, it has now become the imperial capital. It's no longer just one city amongst many cities. It is no longer a center of power. It is the center of power. And it is also the center of power for what becomes a new body, the state armies. Now, the state armies are full-time soldiers. This is something that didn't really happen in the real world, but Warhammer is not the real world. Warhammer is, let's just say, fightier. Much fightier.
That's the only way to put it.
Yeah, much fightier. And we got ourselves permanent regiments and a permanent police force that had come out from the works of Kim Newman in particular. He was often referencing real world fiction like Dickon of Dock Green. Dixon of Dock Green, for anyone who knows their older TV shows. Even his primary character is Detlef Sierck. The playwright is named after Detlef Sierck, the German filmmaker. Kim Newman is a massive film buff, a huge film buff. He writes for, or at least he wrote for ages, for Empire magazine, which is one of the primary reviewers of movies here in the UK. And he still reviews movies like nobody's business. And he's absolutely obsessed with vampires. Tons of his work deals with vampires. And his version of Altdorf was kind of pushed aside for this new great shimmering version where the three toll bridges were still sort of there, but now we had steam bridges which were moving up and down. The city itself was huge. It was using expansive language, not tight medieval language. It was using the center of this great diplomatic empire, led by Karl Franz, who is effectively like a god king riding a griffin, effectively streaming across the heavens with his golden armor going, "Look at me! Everyone follow me! I'm the diplomatic whiz!" Now, admittedly, when you looked at Karl Franz's stats, they were pretty decent. And they did completely contradict what had come in Warhammer beforehand, where Karl Franz, spoiler alert, give you a moment to not know if you don't want to know what happens in the first enemy within. Spoiler alert, he dies. And is replaced by Heinrich Todbringer, who is effectively Karl Franz as he's presented inside the Empire Army List. So we get ourselves a big city. It's not given any numbers. It's just described as the center of the Empire. And the Empire is spun as the greatest, most important individual realm in the old world. It's no longer spun as just one of them. It is spun as the most important. And Altdorf is their Rome. Now, if you know anything about Rome, you know that that's a pretty big freaking place. Yeah. Rome was a big city, and this was their fantasy version of it. It was, if anything, even bigger, even more mental. A center of a great empire that had been working alongside other empires or kingdoms or princedoms around it for time immemorial. And because of the very nature of the Warhammer world, instead of everyone moving out, they all huddled together. And they fielded an enormous state army that had really quite an enormous reach as well. This, in turn, changes over the course of time. And they repeatedly look back to what was sitting inside the 4th edition of the army list for Warhammer and repeat it and repeatedly say it's a city that is huge. It's a city of islands. It's a city of bridges. It's a huge place with the colleges of magic, with the engineering guild, with the Altdorf University. It's a place where the student population alone is probably in the region of about 45,000 people, because there's about 10,000 at least inside the University of Altdorf alone, because it's the biggest university in the old world, because it's the center of their IP, as in the intellectual property of Warhammer, because it's at the very heart of everything they were creating. Every time that they describe it, they always use some superlative along the lines of, it's the biggest in the old world. It's the most impressive. And as we all know, Warhammer dials everything up to 11. We've discussed this more times than we care to mention in previous streams. That Altdorf, slowly but surely, pitched past 11 into 12 into 13, much like Karl Franz, who started off as a pretty pathetic, relatively incapable emperor in his first iteration. And slowly but surely, Karl Franz became more capable, and more capable, and more capable. He got covered in golden armor. He moved up onto a griffin. He charged across the skies. He shouted down elves. He shouted down dwarves. He bound them all together. He was the most impressive diplomatic figure of his era. He was the most impressive diplomatic figure and warlord. There was no better general than him, than perhaps maybe Kurt Hereborg, his good old pal who sat at his shoulder. But, you know, really, he was better. And slowly but surely, over the course of time, everything got power creeped up like crazy. And Altdorf followed until the end times. And this is where it gets almost hilarious. Because come the end times, something that I think you will all out there be able to agree, both Sotek and I deeply respect.
It was handled with great care. Is that what you're about to say? Yeah.
I absolutely. Handled beautifully. In the end times, Altdorf became a key central part of that campaign. And they went, well, hey, if we're doing that, we best do a map, shouldn't we? And what did they do? They went back to the first edition. The very first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Yeah, they're like, we don't want to pay someone to make a map.
We're not going to make a new one. What we're going to do is we're going to ignore everything that happened since 1992. And we are going to disregard 30 years worth of descriptions where they described it as an island city with great white walls around it. We're going to ignore all of that, and we're going to return to the original map, which marks each building and is designed for a city of approximately 15,000 people. And you'll find that the numbers that they start discussing start taking that into account. And the end times get some really weird numbers thrown around and a really weird map where Altdorf bizarrely shrinks again. Karl Franz's great capital dials right down to a relatively small medieval real world city. And it goes from being the great, let's say, the great Rome of Warhammer to just another tiny German town. And that's a fascinating choice to take. And of course, we would think that was a really good idea.
Mm-hmm.
The end times comes and goes. Altdorf gets sacked, and I think that some of the core details that Altdorf made that had happened to Altdorf, it gets sacked in a way that doesn't necessarily quite fit for the city they'd made, but it doesn't matter because it's the city they used. And then we come up to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. And this is where I step in, because I was asked to yet again describe the city. Do I actually have it here? I've got the book here. I don't have the book here. I'll see if I can quickly grab a copy while I'm going on. In the background.
I've got one.
So I was asked to describe it because I was writing that book. And I had a bit of a problem because I had 30 years worth of lore that was slowly creeping up as a graph, describing just how awesome it is. Now, clearly, large parts of that were nothing more than, let's call it imperial propaganda. But some of it absolutely wasn't. You couldn't say that Rome wasn't great. It was. You couldn't say that Constantinople wasn't this amazing city. They are both humongous cities, particularly when they're at their peak. And Altdorf is at its peak come Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, pardon me. So I was in a position where for the core book, I had to write, that's the old map again. I had to write a version of it. So for the core book, I sat down and I was like, right, what am I going to do? So I've got, do I go for 15,000? Do I go for what Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition said, which was 100,000? Do I go for what the description says, which is like 1 million? These are 3 completely different numbers, and all of them are probably wrong. So I did what I considered to be the best option. I asked. Because why should I make it up? It's not my setting. I don't do this. So I went to Games Workshop and I said, right, so we've already got a treatment for Altdorf, which has been written by T.S. Luckert. And the one that's been written by T.S. Lukert is relatively small. It's a city that sits at the heart of the empire and is supposedly the biggest city in the empire. But if we run with that, we're not going to be able to run with the big empire, as in the empire with a population of like 20 million plus or even bigger. We can't really go for the state armies being permanent soldiers because there's going to be so few of them. We're going to have to reword it, rejig it. My core question is Altdorf the old world's Rome, the old world's Constantinople? Is it that, or is Altdorf actually one of the smaller cities inside the old world? Is Marienburg the biggest at like 100,000, 120,000, 150,000? Or is some other one the biggest? We need to nail this down because for the role-playing side, these are important, if not necessarily numbers, but definitely descriptors. So while we're discussing it, is it a thronging city where everyone's banging into each other, shoulder to shoulder, because it's so thick with people? Or is it just a dirty, medieval-style city with slop getting slung out windows, and colleges of magic in the background, relatively small, a university with perhaps a population of not much larger than 300? Or is it the bigger version? Which is it? And the answer was fast and immediate. Altdorf's their Rome.
Yeah, big.
It's their Rome. There's only one city that is bigger in the old world, and that's Marienburg. Marienburg has massively inflated. So we want you to repitch it back to what it should be. Ignore the end times material. I got told to ignore it directly. Ignore it and write it as all of the history of Altdorf would suggest that it should be, because it is at the very core of our setting, and we would like it to be done justice. So I wrote not very much. It was like about half a page worth of detail. It went into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 that was to describe Altdorf. And in that one, it's the classic Karl Franz holds court in Altdorf, capital of Reichland, empire as a whole, and it goes about mighty Reich and Talabek and all the rest. And it you can go read it yourself if you want to go check out Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. There's bits there, but it does indeed speak about the city being in constant construction. This is not a city that is fixed. This is a city that is going through change. It is a city of new bridges and buildings and great engineering masterworks. It has massive steam bridges that are quite different to anything you would get in the real world. There are magical contraptions here as well, much like if you ever look at, say, Realm of the Ice Queen. One of the bridges there is literally made by the Ice Queen out of magic ice. And similarly, the colleges of magic have made their mark upon the city. The colleges of magic are spread across the city in a variety of fun, exciting, important places. There's not just mismatched islands, and I think I said enormous tenements, some of which are like 10, 12 feet stories high. They're properly huge, enormous rookeries all over the place. It draws merchants and diplomats from across the known world. It is cosmopolitan. It is not a place that we view as Germanic. This is a place that's like Rome. All people come here from across the world. It's got Cathaean sections. It has got Nipponese sections. It has got large populations of elves, large populations of dwarves, large populations of ogres, and as it says directly into it, large populations of even odder creatures. It was important that we left the door open to say there were other species in Altdorf. Not just the ones you expect, but to cover that, just in case Games Workshop got a little bit scared and they didn't want to add any other species, because that happens sometimes, it then immediately goes on to discuss the Imperial Zoo. And we discuss things like the Abomination of Stirland or the Drakwild Gibberbeast or other crazy stuff that you get there. And that could easily be the crazy creatures that are inside Altdorf. But the door was purposely left open so that things like gnomes could be added, things like some weird creature from End or Koresh or whatever had diplomatic embassies there and were a part of the city. This is a city that is at the heart of imperial politics and old world politics. So that's how it was broadly built. I'll also mention that I also dropped down a couple of allusions to the Great Reek. The Great Reek being the place where, loosely speaking, Altdorf is sited in the center of these great marshes. Mighty open salty marshes, and the stink that rises out of that during the summer months is horrendous. So it's called the Great Reek. It's a loose allusion as well to Old Reeky, which is a name for Edinburgh, because Altdorf has always been, in terms of the way it's been written by many of its writers, a close mixture of Edinburgh and London, much like the works of Robert Louis Stevenson. If you look at, say, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where that's pretty much Edinburgh, but sort of London, and it's a nice little amalgam between the two. And Altdorf has often taken up that role because they are the capitals that most of the writers understand and know, because they are mostly British. So they always refer back to the great capitals that they understand. So you'll find that Altdorf is often pitched as having an East End accent, sort of, London accent. They're down with the boys and so on and so forth. Anyway, all of that was put in. The Great Reek was also put in because it's been mentioned in a couple of novels. It was mentioned in the Archaeon novel, for example. I think Everchosen mentioned the Great Reek in there. And that was also included because I wanted to foreshadow what was going to happen to Altdorf in the end times. That big stinky end that it was about to have, which was going to be pretty damn awful. So there's also the important foreshadowing of what is to come interlaced into that little paragraph. So I mentioned the great centers of learning, did all the rest, and that was it done. I picked that over to Games Workshop, and they said, yes, great. That's exactly what we want. Plus, you didn't number anything. That is good. So we don't need to actually say whether it is a huge city. The words say it's huge, but you don't say there's 1 million people there. That's kind of cool. And I said, great. And this is where I'm now winding down towards the end of my intro. What an intro, eh? 42 minutes past the hour, and the intro's coming to an end. At 42 minutes past the hour, the Altdorf book was lined up. Now, I was producing the game by this point, and I was in a position where I was going to have to try and detail the whole city. So I realized that there were so many sources for Altdorf out there that there was absolutely no chance that I could catch them all. No matter how many times I read the books, I was going to miss something. And I wanted the book to include everything. I wanted this book to be the definitive version of what Altdorf was. So I crowdsourced it, because that made sense to me. I went over to the Rat Catchers Guild, which if you don't do the roleplay side of the game, you'll have never heard of. The Rat Catchers Guild is a Discord server that's there for Warhammer Fantasy roleplay players. It's one of the biggest ones. It was sort of covertly set up by Cubicle 7 back in the day. And when I was the producer, I was always on there. I was answering questions. I was discussing the game, doing stuff over there. And I set up a big spreadsheet. And I said, hey, there's no way I can go through every computer game. There's no way I can go through every book. There's no way I can go through every army list. There's no way I can go through all of this stuff so that I can get every source. But if you all help me, I can. And we can pull out every single last thing. And there was a lot of enthusiasm. The idea of actually getting a book that did take into account everything that was out there was super exciting, not just for me to put it together, but for everybody else as well, because we all have our own versions of Altdorf, which are generally designed from the novels we've read, or from the books that we've read, the army lists, the discussions that we've had as we've role-played in them. And the idea of getting something that incorporated all of that into one and making something definitive was just cool. So a lot of excitement spread as this document slowly but surely started to get filled in. While that was going, I went down to Games Workshop and I said, right, I'm planning the book and I want to make sure that I don't screw this one up. Because for me, this one's enormously important because Altdorf has been a city that I have been role-playing in for, and then this is where I pause and go, 40,
about the specific number.
40 years. I've got a very clear vision of what this place is like now, having been using it for this long and having read all of the books multiple times. But this is my vision. This isn't your vision. And what we need to do is ensure that whatever is built is your version of it, because this is your city. What should I do? So I spent down and sat down for a full day working my way through what Altdorf should be. And loosely speaking, we ended up with a city that was the equivalent of the old world Rome, but dialed up to Empire 11 with a Karl Franz motherfucking griffin. And we all sat and grinned at each other. Well, 3 of us. There was only 3 there. 4, actually. 4 at the end, because it was really freaking cool. And it took into account everything that existed, and I went back and we started writing it. Me and Andy Leask. You may know Andy Leask from the LAWhammer streams where he played Piece of Sigmar. And we started writing it. Then I resigned. So all of that work went nowhere.
Trash.
Literally nowhere. Because 2 reasons. Number one, I resigned, so all the impetus behind the spreadsheet stopped. It just stopped happening. But it was no longer needed because I wasn't doing it anymore. So that sort of just stopped. And on the other side, Andy was so disappointed with the whole situation as it was, he didn't want anything that he had written to go into the new book they were making. So he withdrew it. He was so upset at the time. And he just went, no, we're done. And I was like, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, we're done. And we kind of walked because it wasn't the best situation in the world. So they had to make their own book. And they made it without any of those resources. And eventually they got their own Crown of the Empire book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. And it made another version of the city.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't draw upon everything that came before. It drew upon some of it. It drew upon bits. And one version of it, I believe it says there's 1 million people there because obviously Games Workshop were still quite keen on it's our Rome, but it wasn't being communicated. What made it even worse was the person that I was speaking to at Games Workshop about it. He moved on. So he was no longer involved with it either.
No.
I won't say who it was because that's utterly not set. But the other person who I was speaking about with it, he's one of Games Workshop's primary freelance writers. I won't say who it was, but again, he's not part of the company, had nothing to do with the book. So once he found out why I resigned, he also said, I'm having nothing to do with it. So we were left with no one involved with the project who started it off and them having no idea what was going to be in it. So they made another version and they did their best shot, but it didn't draw upon everything that came before. So we ended up with yet another retcon, yet another rebuilding of the city that didn't take into account everything that had happened over 30 years, but wasn't the same as the version that was in the end times. It wasn't the same as the version that had been built up since Warhammer 4th edition, but also wasn't the same as Warhammer 1st edition. So that is where we are today as we finish our great intro to what is Altdorf. We've got the version from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, which is a relatively small-scale Germanic city. We have a version from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Let's use Fantasy Roleplay as the guide. Fantasy Roleplay 2, which is a city of about 100,000 people. We've got the version from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3, which is just the big capital. Yay! We've got the version from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, which was both huge and then later completely retconned into something else. We've got the version from the End Times, which scaled it right back down again because they went right back to the original source and went, oh, look at what it used to look like. Let's just use that because it's easy, I presume. I wasn't there in the room. I wasn't in the room when it happened. And then on top of all of that, we also have not just 1 or 2 or 3 or 5, 10, 15. We have scores of authors, all of whom have read some, none, or parts of those bits of lore and written their own versions into their novels, into their novellas, into their games, meaning that we have so many different versions of the capital of the empire that it's very hard for us as we sit down to say this is the definitive version because there isn't one. There just isn't. Altdorf is what you want it to be. So take that into account as we start discussing its history and we start discussing some of its key locations. But I will end my lovely intro as we're heading towards our first hour by saying that if you want to go and actually look at the spreadsheet that I was building, I still have it up there. And I'm bringing this one up because over on the LAWhammer Discord, I'm going to give you a link just now. I'll sort with Sotek to get a link popped down into either the video description or
it'll be
as a first comment or whatever. Okay, so I've just popped that up into the chat. So you've got it right now in the chat. So if you're watching this live, you should hopefully have a nice little link you can go through, which will take you directly through to the spreadsheet. This was the unfinished one, and I relatively recently revivified it, largely because I'm playing in Altdorf again. I fully intend to make a new Altdorf map, and it will literally look like nothing that Games Workshop ever produced because it's going to be an Altdorf map that matches the descriptions that we've had over the course of the last 40 years, which means it will be a city on islands. And that is so very different to the river that moves like a Y through the city and 3 sections that we've had from pretty much every map afterwards. So, that is where I end my intro. I think I've done my job. I now need to say nothing. Over to you, Sotek.
So before we get caught up on super chats and stuff, I want to do a brief thing of saying that for someone that doesn't come from nearly that storied of a history with Altdorf, especially as like growing up, I was far more obsessed with like a lot of the grander aspects of the world, or focusing on things like lizardmen and stuff like that. The Empire usually wasn't super present to my mind because I didn't play the role play game until probably like the early 2010s was when I finally got exposed to it and started playing like second edition. And then I only played a little while of that before fourth edition came out. And what's very, very interesting is that for me, my brain's version of Altdorf that I got to interact with and fall in love with and spend countless hours with was actually the Warhammer Online Age Reckoning version of Altdorf, which is such an interesting map to go back and look at because they take a very clever perspective of making it where you only get to hang out in a small portion of the city, but that portion of the city is so packed with buildings and events and characters, and like it feels like a legit city. Like it feels like you're running around the busiest city in the Empire. And even then, they do a clever job in the game of like, oh yeah, you can run around this section and spend countless hours, but the actual city is like, whoa, it's super big, and you're only running around 3 tiny little districts of it, which is absolutely so fascinating to like listen to all that. And you can tell that they definitely use kind of that old first edition because you don't cross any bridges and stuff. You're just running around between like the Imperial Palace, the poor district, where the Bright College is burning everything down, and then the cathedral, and that's about it.
I have exceedingly fond memories of that game.
Yeah, but it was beautiful. Like it was a lovingly crafted map, and they put a surprising amount of awesomeness into it, and you can genuinely spend a massive amount of time there. Like even in the private server that's still running nowadays, Altdorf is a busy fucking place, which is great. That's what it should be. So with that said, and we will talk more about like kind of what's happened to it since and the different versions that are still floating around. Let's go ahead and get caught up on all super chats and stuff because there's some, and then we will hop into there are specific questions and concepts and things that I'm going to be throwing at Andy as we discuss the city in depth. So real quick, Corin Shima, welcome back, Andy. Yes, welcome back, Andy. It's so
thank you very much. I no longer look like the surface of Mars.
Schwarzage, Tamarcon has risen.
As has Andy.
He has. And that's how excited he was for Lorebeards today. Andy likes Tamarcon. He's taken over Sotek's YouTube body. Yeah.
You're moving on swiftly.
Can't think of a better birthday present than getting to listen to my 2 favorite lore masters.
Hey!
But you deepen my appreciation for the world. Thanks and keep it up. Well, thank you, Mitchell, and happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Mitchell. Happy birthday to you.
Very nice. Quizzer, Nurgle just seems really obsessed with messing with Altdorf to the point he messed with the podcast. Yeah. Russ W, just want to say you guys rock. I enjoy the streams with you. Thanks for all the hard work you put in regarding Altdorf. The first city I put a Skaven nuke under in Total War Warhammer. Greatest, best explosion. Yes. Definitely one way to clean up the city. F, great to see you guys. Brilliant news. Andy definitely shouldn't be awake now. What career do you most like to pursue in Altdorf? Love from Australia.
Yeah, I'll drop a small anecdote in this one, actually. The number of different knightly orders that were grounded in Altdorf that I listed out when I went down to Games Workshop was one of the primary reasons they were like, yeah, you're right. Altdorf is actually pretty freaking huge, isn't it? I had a list of, I can't remember how big it was. This was almost 5-6 years ago now. But as I recall, it was like 35 different knightly orders, of which several of also hinted at sister orders, and each of them, some of them were actually big, like a good couple of hundred members, and they were like, well, how many knights are there in Altdorf? I mean, how many knights are there in Altdorf? This is ridiculous. There's probably more knights in Altdorf than there was original population for the entire city. How do we incorporate this? And with a certain amount of moving some of it out of the city, making the city the size that they wanted it to be, we got it all to work in the end. So the careers, which is why I bring it up, being a knight is going to pretty much guarantee you a position in Altdorf. So many nights.
Yeah. Absolutely. Sage Master, doing karaoke for my birthday. Any Lorebeards song requests? Oh,
If we're doing Altdorf, it's going to have to be "They Built This City."
there you go. Yeah, if you want to do Broadway nerd stuff, do Build the Wall from Hadestown. There you go.
Built this city. I'm trying to think from Rock and Corn. No, that's not good.
Rock and Corn. See beforehand, we all know Altdorf would be a very different place without the brilliant real estate tycoon Krimlo's iron grip on the housing market. But what do you think of his plan to gentrify the Hafenstadt?
The Hafenstadt. Hafenstadt was a fun addition that was added for the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay because the halflings up to the 4th edition of Fantasy Roleplay had been poorly served as nothing more than joke characters who were somewhat similar to hobbits. So one of the core design goals behind putting the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay into place was to take a look at what was effectively one of the primary character choices and give that species a bit more depth. The Hafenstad, with the Hafen being quite literally the name that they used for themselves, the Hafen, which had become slang down to halflings by many. And Hafenstad also beautifully, let's say, marrying with Hafen, the German word, sort of like the safe harbor stad that they lived over in the East End. So yeah, good times putting that one together. That was fun.
Mr. Vorn, Total War Warhammer 3 Altdorf is heresy. Too much grass. Well, you know, Total War is working under a budget.
Yeah. I think you should always keep in mind that when you're looking at Total War, they have a limited budget. They have not just it's not just that it's a limited budget, but even if their budget was huge, they still have to program it all. The real limit is time. It takes lot to build a game. And to try and give the individuality that everything requires for Warhammer would take years and years of development without getting any resource in return. So take it with a pinch of salt, enjoy it for what it is, but don't view it as necessarily the best representation of all things.
Yeah, as much as we would all love to have a genuinely recreated Altdorf as a unique map, like, man, that'd be a lot of effort into one city that most campaigns would never see.
Yeah.
So, you know,
a big waste of resources.
Yeah, like now, if there was a time and a place, you know, when you're dealing with like a RPG type setting, like they did with the MMO, or if someone made like a Baldur's Gate 3 version of the Enemy Within, that would be an appropriate time to look at Altdorf and be like, all right, let's make this Altdorf. As opposed to like a battle game where you're not going to be there 99.99999% of the time.
Totally.
Jonathan Scott, in the lore, dwarves seem to enjoy whiskey and they've had the technology to distill advanced spirits for millennia. So why don't they have distilleries?
They do.
Yeah, they do. Yep. Yep. Jonathan Scott, Marion Burgers will let anyone through if they pay. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I wrote an article about that for Shades of Empire regarding just how high the tolls were for the Imperial fleet to get through Marienburg, and they were high.
Yeah, Marienburg has done an excellent job of holding
everything to ransom,
everyone hostage. Yeah. Let's see, Mr. Warren, City of Islands, massive port, Total War Warhammer 3. Yeah, the best I can do is a water fountain.
Well, you know, that'll do.
Yeah. It's the same thing with Marienburg. You know, the Warhammer Total War Marienburg is nothing like actual Marienburg, but if they were to faithfully recreate it, it'd be a lot of effort for very little payoff.
Yeah.
Yes, Games Workshop in numbers, like a fish out of water.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue that Games Workshop have faced pretty much from the beginning. And even though there have been articles written about, for example, each model that you see in a Warhammer army is representative of 10, 8, 100 men on the battlefield, the scaling changes according to which edition that you look at. And the scaling for the cities that are fielding these armies in turn get some particularly, let's say, interesting descriptions.
Yeah, well, and there's also the super notorious thing of like anyone that tries to have genuine good faith nerd arguments about elements of the fantasy universe, and they start pulling out actual numbers, anyone that's a seasoned veteran will go, "Don't do that. You're gonna go insane. Don't do that," because they don't know what they're pulling out. They're just gonna make shit up. Sean, is GW just a skaven that has ADHD? It's not
more a colony of Skaven. Indeed, I think that's actually one of the issues that you need to understand when we're dealing with any parts of lore, and that's that it is there to serve a purpose, and that purpose changes as Games Workshop itself changes over time. But not only does Games Workshop change, its staff change, and some of their staff have very strong opinions that something should be big or something should be small. And that means that the output that comes from Games Workshop or its licensors or Black Library or anywhere else also changes in turn. And that means that we, as people who are gathering the lore and looking at it and trying to make it all make sense, are left going, well, it doesn't, because it didn't need to for Games Workshop's purposes.
Yep. Watchdog, how was Altdorf named in world?
We'll get to that, because originally it wasn't called Altdorf, it was called Reichdorf.
Yeah, we'll get into like the in-world history and all this stuff here in just a minute. Seth 45er, just a quick theological question. Does the Empire have a god of sewers? My Wolfram GM likes to send me and my friends into them every damn time we visit Altdorf. We need to know who to curse and how to appease them.
That's really interesting. I can't, off the top of my head, think of a god that is specifically tied to sewers. I can think of several gods that have very much fought for the sewers. Verena has, Shalia has, for example, and Nurgle. But I can't think of one that specifically is. I'm going through my head, and not one is jumping out. So if you want one, I would suggest building one for your hammer. Why not? That'd be super fun.
It would be very interesting to see like what kind of mythology or religious type things that like sewer guilds have picked up over the years, because of the things they have to see and face down there.
Yeah,
they're like, we need our own guardian.
Yeah, because you'd have sewer jacks. They'd almost certainly have a patron of some sort. Yeah, there'd definitely be something in that. That'd be super fun to write up. So I think that'd be worthwhile for your time, at least so you have someone to curse.
Yep. Nils, we'll miss the stream. We'll watch afterwards. Just want to say hi and thanks for the streams. Oh, well, thank you. We really appreciate that.
Nils. You rock.
Hammond, never seen the Brackenwalsh mapped. Where is it?
The Brackenwalsh being?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up, but I'm sure Hammond will let us know in the chat.
Okay, so if the Brackenwalsh is a name that I'm not aware of for the Riker Flats. I couldn't even get that out. Sometimes words just fail. You're right, they haven't been. They, to a degree, were dropped into, if it is that you're discussing, a map that was used for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 in the Enemy Within campaign right at the beginning. They had a big hex map, and they showed that Altdorf was actually not the point where the rivers, the Reich and Talabek, meet. It's just one of the places they meet, and the rivers actually spread all around the city on both sides as it spreads out amongst all of the marshes that lie all around it. So if it's that, there is a very weak map that's that as the campaign map for Death on the Reich. But beyond maps I've made myself for my own games, yeah, you're right, there's nothing that really came out.
Oh, well, there you go. And then the last one before we get back into the actual chatting about the lore and stuff, the history, we have, this is a great stream and I'm really enjoying it, but when are we going to talk about Filthy Harold and his Magnan throwing knife?
Well, do you, punk? Yeah, so Kim Newman is the best. And I grew up on Kim Newman's tales of Altdorf, in particular Filthy Harold, definitely not Dirty Harry, being one of those. And his Magnum throwing knife, not a Magnum gun, honest, is very much a part of that. And will we discuss that? I mean, we, to a degree, already have. We're discussing the city itself, though, rather than the characters. So I imagine they will be something that's sitting there in the background rather than something we particularly discuss. For all I would love to, because I'd put a big smile on my face.
Yeah. Okay, so Hammond clarifies it's where the the hag character.
That's pretty much just the surrounding flats as well, deep into the ones. And yes, I'd forgotten that name. Thanks for bringing it out. That's because most of the maps that I do don't need the older names. I only use the older names that are dropped in, say, for example, Time and Legend books and similar when I'm creating material, if I'm using that as a language source for a new name that comes later. So in this particular instance, sadly, no.
Then we have Biofoot from Twitch chat. Does Marienburg supply all of the Empire store of Opdok? Are you trying to say Updog? Is that what this is? Because I don't know what Opdok is, but it sounds
I
like
don't know what it is either. Oh,
it sounds like an Updog joke.
so
That's I guess run with.
assuming we're not on a joke, and just speaking more broadly, Marienburg is one of Altdorf's primary sources for many things, but equally Altdorf is one of Marienburg's primary sources for many things. The trade between the two cities is deep, extensive, and essential for both of their continued existences. One of the primary reasons that Altdorf wants to take Marienburg is because they rely on it so much. One of the primary reasons they don't take Marienburg is because they rely upon it so much.
Then we have Mornington Crescent. Always felt it was the Discworld answer for Altdorf. You don't need to show New York, just Manhattan. Yeah.
Actually, that's actually a really good answer, Mornington.
Yep.
And absolutely agreed.
And then there's
a few extra that popped in just at the end because
there's another one. So Biofoot, where's the Fisherman Quarter in Altdorf? Trick question. The entire city is the Fisherman Quarter.
You're correct.
Yeah, though there actually are some fun references in several books that there may well be a fisherman presence beneath the river in the city. And people may vanish on the nights where the fog is especially thick. Because why not make Altdorf more horrifying than it already is when you can just get stabbed in the streets? And then there's another super chat. Well, I'll just read it. So Biofoot says, Andy, have you fought off or submitted to the Earthfather? Well, he's sitting here talking to us, so presumably he fought him off.
Yeah, I'm still going. This time.
All right, and then to get caught up on the last few super chats that came in, and then we're all officially caught up. So we have Jonathan Scott. They do talking about dwarf distilleries. Okay, if they have distilleries, then I have questions. What proof is dwarfish risky? Are there any famous distilling families? Can humans safely consume it?
So proof, that's a question that's not answered. Famous distilling families, yes. Can humans safely consume it? Some of them, yes.
Yeah, it would. It depends on the human and the brew.
Dwarfs. Yeah, a lot of dwarfs. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, like I would assume Bugman's family could probably be considered a famous distilling family if you want an example.
Brewing more than distilling, but yes, the Bugmans in general.
Yeah, as an overall clan involved throughout like kind of the whole process. Jack Flanagan, welcome back, Andy and Sotek. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Ron Leashed, will you guys finish trailer reaction soon? Yes, this Wednesday.
Definitely. This Wednesday.
Yep. And it'll be here, exact same place.
Damn straight it will. So will we start with history or will we start with where it's cited?
I think it would probably be better to start with the history of Altdorf in its most recent-ish iterations, probably, because that's going to change a little wildly based on which book you read.
Yeah, totally is. So loosely, my little bit on this, and I'll let Sotek go wild on it, is that way back in the midst of time, some 3,000 years before the world comes to an end, the Unberigan tribe of humans was making its way through the Great Reich Basin, as it would come to be called. So this is the great dip that lies between the World's Edge Mountains on one side, the Grey Mountains on the other, that big area where all the water drains out through the River Reich. The River Reich is a river that is bluntly enormous. Truly huge. Do not think of it as an equivalent to a German river. It is not. It is as large as the largest rivers over in Russia, for example, because this is the old world. It's dialing up the real world to 11, as we've discussed on more than one occasion. It is at often points multiple miles across, particularly in its lower reaches. And the eventual position of Altdorf is enormously important because it spreads out wide and turns into multiple small channels that are easy to cross, meaning that it is the primary natural bridge between the Reichland, as it will come to be known, and the rest of the flats elsewhere, and the empire as a whole. It is a natural bridging point. Now, there are still some very deep, swift flows, but in the center of it, there's a great rise, hills that sit in the center of these great confluences. And this is where Altdorf itself was built on some of the strongest, let's say, positions. The Amberigans build their forts here, and they don't call it Altdorf, they call it Reichdorf. You could argue that the word Reich comes from Reich, as in the empire. It's almost sitting at the heart of it, or king, if you prefer. You'll find that some of the translations that are mentioned in some of the books use the word Reich to effectively refer to king, because of the original kings of the Amberigans, the king chiefs, as they were, or the god king, as Sigmar will in time come to be called. And this is where Sigmar will be born, approximately 2,500 and a bit years before the end of all things. And he is born in Reichdorf. Now, you'll find that there are conflicting tales about this, but loosely speaking, he is born in the confluence between the rivers Reich and the rivers Talabek. And they are called, at this point, something similar to Reich and Talabek, but spelt in very different ways because of the ancient languages that they had there. And a twin-tailed comet was flying across, heralding his birth, unless we go with the old world version, but let's just not get too caught up in that. Let's just call it a misprint. So, heralding his birth and starting effectively kicking off the... Well, let's actually be blunt about this. Kicking off the story that's the founding of the empire and the eventual end of the world. The empire is intrinsically linked through to all of this. And 2,500 years ago, Reichdorf is a fortified village that sits on the confluence of the rivers in a dry area surrounded by miles of marsh, within which there are indeed some rather nasty monsters and orcs that attack on the day of his birth, and of course a few witches as well. And that is the birth point of what will one day become Altdorf. But it won't be called Altdorf for almost 1,000, well, in fact, almost exactly 1,000 years afterwards, when the city eventually gets redubbed. Now, if you want to get a loose timeline for the Reichland and the Empire as a whole, the glorious Reichland section in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition is a really good starting point. It basically says, in the beginning, there was Reichdorf. 1,000 years later, it was actually an old town, so they called it Old Town instead, Altdorf. As 1,000 years later, it got redubbed that when the great Cathedral of Sigmar is finally raised, and it becomes Altdorf. And loosely, my little bits that I'll say from its early time is that it is not the capital of the empire. It's the first capital, but the capital moves as each emperor is elected. And for a long time, Altdorf is the bigger of the, let's call them towns and then eventually cities, but oftentimes it's one of the smaller ones. And through the course of time, different emperors will be here or elsewhere, and it will become always an important point because it is at the natural bridging point over the rivers Reich and Talabek. It is pretty much the only place you can do it. There is no way you can bridge any way across the river all the way down to Marienburg. Marienburg at the very bottom is, again, another marsh where it spans out into a mighty fan delta. And that delta, again, offers bridging opportunities. But the river is far, far too wide to bridge between Altdorf and Marienburg. And get this, between Altdorf all the way up to Nuln, there's only a single place where you could potentially put a bridge. It's called the Loreley Rock. And that rock is so freaking dangerous that no one would put a bridge there because there's water spirits that drown everyone that goes close to it. So loosely speaking...
Very nice of them. Yeah.
Very nice of them. Yeah, totally. Altdorf becomes one of the most important cities by dint of its natural location. In the same way that Nuln becomes one of the most important locations because it sits at the first natural bridging point across the River Reich. And it's hundreds of miles upriver. Hundreds. And I think this is... We have dwarfs here who can build sky bridges. And if you know anything about sky bridges, they basically can connect mountains together. They're so properly crazy. Yeah. Okay, it's fair to say dwarves don't like water, though. In the same way that they do like big open spaces, but they don't like all that rushing water. That's not their business. sitting out
There are
between them.
trolls down there.
There's all sorts of
Only a
horrors down
manling
there.
would try and live along rivers.
But they could bridge it in a variety of places, but the Reich itself is just too wide, too dangerous to do so. The engineering required and the cost required is too high. So Altdorf, as my piece of introduction for its history, is so important because of where it is naturally.
Yeah, so some interesting things to keep in mind is that, just to put it deep into perspective, think of the biggest river that you've ever seen in your life, where you're sitting and you look across and you're like, wow, I can't even see like the other side. This is bigger. That like the rivers of the Reich and the Taliban, especially the Reich, you have to remember that this is a river that's so wide and deep and massive that Altdorf is able to have an entire fleet hanging around. And not only is it like a fleet, but canonically it had one of the mega ships from Dreadfleet in it. It had the I can't remember what freaking the lead ship's called. Yeah, the Heldenhammer. This giant.
My one's broken. Damn it! I've got it here somewhere.
It's like this absolutely colossal vessel that is so big that it has a full-sized Church of Sigmar or cathedral, whatever you want to call it, sitting on the top of it. Like this thing is massive, and it's able to fit into the port comfortably along with an entire other fleet. This is a titanic river that this city sits at this junction of, and like Andy says, why it's so critical, because there is no way across. Like logistically, it doesn't matter who you are, how strong you are, you just can't get across it. It's just too big. And so these cities just form these really, really critical points, which is a big reason why they always feature so heavily as the big battle points, even beyond the idea of like, oh, it's the capital.
Yeah. So we can loosely describe the most important cities in the Empire purely because of the River Reich. One is Altdorf, because you can cross the Reich and Talabek in the center of the Empire. One is Marienburg, because you can cross the Reich at the bottom. One is Nuln, because you can finally cross the Reich way upstream. And one is Talabek, Talabheim, pardon me, because again, there's a bridge over the Talabek at Talabheim, but between Talabheim and all the way down to Altdorf, it's pretty much unbridgeable. And the only way you can get across is using boats. So these cities are absolutely essential. And Altdorf is arguably at the heart of them all. And by dint of its central location, and by dint of the fact that Sigmar was born there, and it becomes the very heart of the cult of Sigmar, and all the pilgrims wish to go there for very obvious reasons. It's not only the heart of the, let's say, river network, it's the heart of the spiritual empire, and is quite literally almost at the center of the empire as well. So even when Altdorf was going through some of its weaker periods, when there had been long periods without an emperor there, where the Prince of Altdorf and the Prince of Reichland as a whole was much less powerful, the city itself was still of extraordinary importance. So much so that when Magnus the Pious eventually binds the empire together some 200 years before the end of the world, which I do love constantly referencing, he pretty much takes control of Altdorf and gives it to one of his closest advisors, while simultaneously moving the court to Nuln, because that is where he wants the capital to be, Nuln. And it's not until Altdorf becomes the capital with the rise of Karl Franz's family, the House of Second Wilhelm or Third Wilhelm, depending upon which version you go for. In fact, it's both, because it's the Second Wilhelm of Reichland or the Third Wilhelm of the Empire, whatever. Doesn't really matter. Until that point, Altdorf is not the biggest city in the empire. Marienburg and Nuln are bigger. But with the rise of the Holzwig-Schließens and eventually the rise of what becomes later the Franz family, we have ourselves a city that explodes again through a mixture of its magical wealth, because at the time of Magnus the Pious, the colleges of magic are founded, and it becomes a center of magical learning, which previously had been held by Middenheim up in the north. So it becomes the center of magical learning, the center of academic learning. It becomes the center of the empire with the emperor there. It becomes the center of pretty much everything, because the cult of Sigmar is also there.
Yeah, the engineering school as well. Yeah, like
exactly.
A lot of important things going on there.
All of the taxes are flowing through that city, and Altdorf, through the period of about 150 years ago up to the time of Karl Franz, swells and swells, far, far beyond what it was before. We're talking about the largest expansion in the empire is all focused in one place, and it becomes this great hulking mass, a city so large that it can barely sustain itself, and a city that is effectively going to become corpulent and doomed as we move towards the end times, where it is pretty much eaten from within by the hosts of, spoilers, Nurgle.
Yeah, there's also some interesting, like, if you delve into if you want to use it, you have the Crown of Altdorf book by Cubicle 7. They add some like additional lots of little history bits. They have like a fun little like 4-page spread for the history. Though what's interesting is that for the prehistory of Altdorf, they run with the idea that like they make Altdorf like super special because it's like it originally was an elf city of the elves, but then it gets smashed and abandoned for the War of Vengeance. And then the dwarves show up and build something there for a little while, but then they leave. And then the Unbergen tribe come in and inherit this like elf, then dwarf, then human place, which isn't necessary. I don't think it's like super necessary, but
I think it's a natural. It is a natural.
It does make sense though,
because it is the highway over the Reich. Without Altdorf or the location that it has, you can't get across. So it is not just an obvious place for the high elves to start. It is, well, the elves, because they're not even high elves at this point. For the elves to start, it is a natural location, and indeed makes complete sense. That was very much part of the version we were building too. And the dwarves then moving in afterwards, because it is the primary road through that part. You've got the other one that goes past Talabheim, and the old dwarf road that connects through to that all the way down through Averheim, up through the old forest road. These are the old dwarf roads that were put in place. And it's also worth noting that these old dwarf roads were paved in the time of Sigmar. So the dwarves were commissioned to pretty much pave all of them during the time of Sigmar. Now, a lot of them fall into disrepair over the course of time. But during the time of Sigmar, so all the way back when everyone's thinking barbarians and chieftains, they have paved roads connecting Middenheim, which isn't called Middenheim, to Altdorf, which isn't called Altdorf, to Talabheim, which isn't called Talabheim, to Averheim, which isn't called Averheim. All of these ancient capitals are all linked together by old dwarf roads, and come the modern version of the empire, you'll find that some of them still carry their old forest road or old dwarf road names because of this. Many of them have got newer names because they might, for example, be the Faustlag road, which the road between Faustlag road is often used for the road between Middenheim down towards Talabheim, for example. So these are natural highways, and arguably Altdorf is in the most important position of them all, because it is pretty much the one that's at the heart of all of those ancient road networks. And we're looking at a road network all the way back to the dwarf and elf times that has pretty much existed in that area now for thousands of years. They are well-beaten tracks.
Yep. It's funny to me to imagine that there has to be a group of grumbling long-beard dwarfs out there who bitch and moan about the Empire changing the name of their cities too often. Like, damn, manlings, how dare they not use the original name of their ancestors? The bastards. So Altdorf, they're probably one of the big things that I think that Andy mentioned briefly that's worth diving into, because it's something I know a lot of people like to ask about and want to know probably why they're put there, would be the colleges of magic, which are probably the most famous set of structures within the city, depending on who you ask. But I think in most people's cases, the colleges of magic tends to jump out as like the big thing.
Yes, colleges of magic.
Why Altdorf?
So this is why Altdorf, because it's Altdorf and Games Workshop wanted to put them there.
Yes,
that's
true.
The real reason. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is because
Altdorf.
Altdorf lies on the confluence, not just of the Reich and the Talabheim, but on the confluence of some great magical ley lines, for want of a simpler way of describing them. All of the great channels of magic that make their way through the old world towards Ulthuan, with the great vortex spirals, pass through Altdorf, using the natural channels that are already there, that have been carved in place by the ancient rivers that are in place. And all of the winds pass through this city, far more so than they do anywhere else. So when Magnus the Pious and Teclis sat down and had a chinwag about exactly what they were going to do about magic. They sat down and they went, where are we going to put these things? Magnus, who came from Nuln, went, not in my city. And Teclis went, well, we've got records of a city that sat at the heart of a confluence. Indeed, there was an ancient dragon that used to live down there. So perhaps we could pop it down into Altdorf. And he's like, yeah, sure, that'll do. That's not Nuln. Brilliant. And it's fair to say that it's a naturally perfect place for the colleges. And that's because it's also naturally a perfect place for everything siphoning through and out of the empire. It is not just one where the rivers pass through, it's where the people pass through, it's where hearts and ideals and dreams pass through and are washed out, because Altdorf is a place that breaks people as well. So loosely speaking, everything comes into Altdorf and comes out broken. And the winds of magic do exactly the same thing as they make their way through and get shoveled off towards the great vortex over Althuin. So they built colleges over the prime confluence of each of the 8 winds of magic in and around Altdorf. The amber wind, for example, that gets attracted to not civilization, it gets attracted to wild places. It gets attracted to atavism and basic natures. But there's a huge mound of hills just down to the south of the city called the, appropriately, Amber Hills, which have a lovely variety of stone circles there that had long gathered all manner of, let's just say, Gur energies. The amber wind down there has been responsible for all sorts of terrible uprisings down to the south of the city as well. There is a host down by the Blood Pine forest. Many forest goblins gather there because it makes the spiders huge, and they come crawling out of there.
Bloodpine Woods are notorious for assaults on Altdorf from greenskins because those spiders are big.
And that's because of the great confluence of Gur in the area allows them to become far larger, far bigger. But each of the winds gathered in different places. There was a very ancient holy site to Verena where the light winds were gathering. There's basically 8 separate places where the colleges could be easily placed. So Teclis settled down and founded the 8 colleges of magic in Altdorf there.
Don't use this version for the colleges unless you have no other choice. It's so boring.
Having said that, though, it is another version. So, as we said, Altdorf gets rebuilt and rebuilt again, and it's very likely that possibly the version that's inside Crown of Empire, where all the colleges are gathered beside the university, rather than spread across the city, where they are at the center of each one of their ley lines. That will become the new norm as new writers come along, look back for what Empire is, and read that one. Now, that stands contrary to the previous 30 years worth of various descriptions of the colleges, but that doesn't mean that won't become the new norm. So for all I personally dismiss it for my own games, that doesn't mean that if I were going to be writing the game that I would dismiss it myself. If I was writing, I would again go to Games Workshop and say, which version do you want? Do you want the older version? Or do you want the one that is presented inside Crown of Empire, which contradicts it? You've got different options available to you there. So we are founded with 8 colleges of magic, each one of which were given a building that epitomized the wind at hand. And that was, for each of the winds, something very, very different. A massive pyramid, a white pyramid for the light wind, to channel the very diffuse white wind into it, but so dangerous is that wind that it actually is separated out into its own pocket dimension because elves.
Yeah, I love the pocket dimension.
gotta love that. It's literally in its own pocket dimension, and when that breaks, all hell breaks loose. We've got ourselves a Celestial College, huge, tall towers where they can peer up into the skies. The Bright College, 21 separate towers, one major tower where
the Bright College, I have to interrupt because I just fucking love this part of that. The Bright College will, if you play Warhammer Online, you fell in love with the Bright College because it is so obnoxious that where it ended up, because, Bright Wizards, fire, it burns down everything around it on a semi-regular basis. So some real estate mogul went, let's put the poor people there.
Yeah, I mean, the Bright College is cited for Total War, not Total War, pardon me, for war. at the very least, the online version of the game, Warhammer Online, thanks, over in the east end of the city. And multiple times they had some accidents and they had burnt everything around them. So it was indeed in the poorer quarter of the city. Over in the very far east end, again, another allusion to London, where the east end was generally perceived to be the poorer part of the city. And the Bright College is, again, tall towers, fire gouting out from the top and long flows of actually spilling down with a massive pillar of fire through the main one. It's also where the colleges of magic hold the great Hall of Jewels, the final, where the next patriarch or matriarch of the 8 colleges of magic will be not chosen, will kick living crap out of the previous one. Hopefully. It's not always like that because it's a big competition and anyone can enter, as we know. Gelt, who will one day eventually take that title from Thyrus Gorman, he wasn't even the patriarch of his order in one of the books. He was just a wizard at that point, and he managed to fight his way all the way up through the course of the Wizard Duels to take control of the colleges of magic. So we've got ourselves 8 colleges, each of which are cited in either A, different places, or over in the University District, all of which represent one of the winds perfectly, and they are the center of magical learning in the Empire, and arguably, come 200 years worth of study, the old world by the time we hit the time of Karl Franz, where there are no other institutions that really have the same depth and breadth of study and learning behind them, because unlike the older traditional versions of magic that have been used by humanity for, in some cases, millennia, in the Empire, it all got pushed aside. It got codified according to the way elves do magic, and humans were granted access to thousands of years worth of magical knowledge siphoned down into very clean how to kick ass spells. Because ultimately, the colleges of magic, contrary to how many perceive them, are not great institutes of wisdom. They are creating nuclear missiles. They are creating force multipliers.
Yeah, it's a military institution.
They are bluntly war wizards. That's what they're made for, and that's what all of their tutelage is designed towards. And they will take pretty much anyone. So if there happens to be someone from Kislev, who is not very well regarded because he is perhaps a man, although that lore may change, and shouldn't be using magic, sure, come on over. If you happen to be a Bretonian who's been hounded by, I don't know, a Fey enchantress or someone, yeah, sure, come on over. If you happen to be a Tillian who's making their way out because of one reason or another, they'll take anyone, they will train them up, and they will saddle them with so much debt they'll never get away, and they will be
student debt, yeah, even in my fantasy universe.
Yes. And they will be front line soldiers. That's what they're made for. And even the most courtly of wizards, or the most old intemperate one who is working to try and figure out what the heavens say, when they are called by the Elector Counts, they have to go to war by law. And if they don't, the cult of Sigmar moves in. And I think we all know what that means.
Yeah. So there's your colleges of magic goodies. I'm going to get us caught up on Super Chat stuff real quick, and then we're going to dive into another topic. So we were here. Grandfather Nurgle says, "Don't resist, Andy. Submit to the grandfather."
Fuck you,
Nurgle. No, get fucked. Inquisitor Thomas, how do we know Andy isn't just hiding the mark of Nurgle somewhere on his body? Well, you'll just have to take it off fate.
Don't.
Yep. Mr. Bourne, how do you sink a Sterling boat? Put it in the water. That's...
I mean, if you actually look at how the River Ster moves and hits the River Reich, it's pretty much waterfalls. So, Sterling boats have to be made of something pretty special. In the modern era, they have a host of locks put in place so that they can get down past these waterfalls. But before that, oh heck, the Ster is not a great river to move down.
Yep. Michael Thomas, thanks both, loving these videos. Oh, we appreciate it. Thanks so much. Laughing God, no joke question, but could you describe the potential fisherman presence or other similar sewer dwelling monsters in Altdorf? We'll hop into the sewer as the next topic thing. Yeah. I will say that the fisherman thing is more of kind of a cheeky reference as opposed to something that's very well detailed out, especially because I think me and Andy talked about this in the fisherman episode, that would very heavily imply that there are, of course, freshwater fishermen as opposed to the saltwater fishermen, which more than likely would be a different species and would operate under different rules. They probably wouldn't be like the same fishermen that you see terrorizing the great ocean. So have fun with it. It could literally be anything. And who knows? Maybe you could even run with the conspiracy. If you're dealing with a roleplay thing, you could actually have a lot of fun with conspiracy theories about how they were like created by the colleges of magic. You know, they're doing magic and it's turning the freaking fishmen gay. All that stuff. So we have Nagarash here. I missed you guys. I had one question about last time. What is your favorite quote from Gotrek and Felix, and or just Warhammer Fantasy in general? Gotrek has some really great ones. Oh Jesus!
I have no idea.
Yeah,
I'm not very good at remembering quotations, which is not a great place.
I'm in the same bubble.
I quite enjoy pulling out Onward to Death when we did the LAWhammer version of Gotrek, purely because he pulled that out. Yes, yeah, totally. Onward to Death! That was quite fun. Yeah, it's a classic, but yeah. Honestly, go reread them again. I've not read them for a few
years. My favorite quote is quite literally the "Who are you?" situation when Thanquil finally gets Gotrek and Felix after 20 years, and he gives a villain monologue, and they have no idea who he is. To me, that is, that is one of the best served "Who are you?" moments that I've read in fiction, because 20 plus years is a long time not really to know your greatest rival. Poor Thanquil. Okay, last two things little here. The talk of the college makes me wonder what other Empire cities could theoretically house one or more of the colleges, considering they have to build them so close to focal point of their respective wins.
Yeah, so each of them could easily host other colleges, and indeed do have their own magical institutions, which are either written into some books or forgotten about in others. Talabheim, for example, is at the very... It's pretty much built into a huge crater that's over 100 miles in circumference. And Talabheim is a center of Gyron as well. The great eye of the forest, as the city of Talabheim is often called, is also at the very heart of Tal worship. Orion worship is also very popular there. Varenan worship, unexpected to many, is also extremely important, bringing in a great deal of Heish. There's a great institute of learning inside Talabheim too. So just taking that one city, it's got a variety of magical draws already in place, some of which have already been adapted by the various wizards that have moved into the place. If you go to, say, Middenheim has a massive let's say onrush of Gur that are spilling out of that city, which we
go watch our Middenheim stream if you haven't already.
Yeah, absolutely. Go check our Middenheim stream for that. But it's also been a center of magical study for centuries. I almost on pretty much since there ever was a city. Magic has never been an issue for Middenheim. So it's really easy to focus in on Altdorf because it became the heart of it. And in many respects, that's because it became this focal point for Games Workshop and all the stories they were telling. So that's where they focused all of their stuff, with occasionally something else dripped out to one of the other primary capitals, with everything else forgotten. But the other cities do have quite a lot to draw upon as well.
Yep. Hell, just enjoying with the new Thrones of Decay stuff. There's Elspeth von Draken has set up a pretty strong nexus of Shaish in Nuln.
Damn straight.
With her legendary her block towers. But yeah, definitely. And then Jonathan Scott, how are the student loans down up to 11 in Warhammer Fantasy Battle? Because instead of owing them to, if you're American, owing them to a private lender or your state or the US government, you owe them to a magical institution that if you go derelict, they will let the witch hunters come after you if they don't send someone after you themselves, and you will die.
Right. Yeah, the debt collectors and Warhammer are not so good. Let me just bring up this little bit there. And yet, Middenheim Gur not mentioned in LAWhammer. I trust you've not watched the most recent episode then. You've just outed yourself. It was the core part when they go delve deep beneath Middenheim. They delve down beneath to find out where the flame is coming from.
Yeah, the most recent episode, which I have, is so goddamn huge that for those of us that missed it and have to catch the VOD like me, it's going to be in 2 parts.
Two-parter. And indeed, I'm intending after this stream for all of our all access people, I'm going to be dropping up links to it because it just went up.
I know what I'm doing today.
So I'm going to be dropping that one up because, it's an interesting episode. It's our birthday episode because we just finished our first year of LAWhammer. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And just to say, it's not really a spoiler. It's the opening of the episode. So that is what you're about to find out about.
Yeah. So, getting back to the topic at hand, let's go beneath Altdorf for a little bit, talking about the sewers and what lurks down there.
Yeah, before we do that, I'd like to just make sure we've got a clear delineation for the history, just so we don't lose it. So that we've got something we can constantly back refer to.
That's fair.
Really
go ahead.
Okay, so we've got, loosely speaking, pre-Reichdorf, where it was elves, then dwarves. We've got the founding of Reichdorf by the Umberrigan tribe. Reichdorf is where Sigmar is born, approximately 2,500 years ago. 1,500 years ago, at the year 1000 IC, Reichdorf is renamed Altdorf when the grand Cathedral of Sigmar is finally finished. Mighty, huge edifice that still stands to this day, some 1,500 years later, when the world then blows up. Altdorf is not the most important city in the empire at this point. It is one of them. And you'll find that it vacillates between being the most important to not being the most important, and its population also increases and decreases according to the needs of the era at hand. We then move to the time of two emperors, when good old Talabheim secedes separate from the other grand provinces of the empire. And the Ottoman emperors then move out, and Talabheim arguably becomes the most important city in the empire. It's almost impregnable because it's in that giant crater wall that we were discussing previously, and everyone kind of gives up them trying to take them out, as Talabheim then moves out to then conquer the grand provinces around them. Reichland and Visenland and Solland at that point, and wherever else, are all working together as what they believe to be the true empire. Approximately 1,500 years after Sigmar, it becomes the time of three emperors. And Altdorf, along with Marienburg and Nuln, stand at the center of the electoral emperors, as they're often called. So these are the ones that still work towards the old election system that was put in place after the abdication of Sigmar some 1,500 years earlier. This continues for about 400 or 500 years until eventually Empress Margrethe she takes control in 1979. She is a reference to Margaret Thatcher, who took control of the UK in 1979. And the empire comes to an end. That's it. Done. It no longer exists as a single unifying force. This is pretty much the years leading up to the old world now. We have 300 years of absolute war, often referred to as the Dark Ages. The vampire wars flash up. There's hundreds upon thousands of kingdoms and duchies and counts. There are new allegiances and old allegiances, and Altdorf stands throughout all of that as a city that is barely ever taken. Although you could argue that whenever a new household takes control of it, the city falls. You could easily argue that. One of the most important families throughout the course of that are the Halskrug family. They pop up in many books in multiple places. And if you go with the older lore, we'll see what the old world does. That was the ruling family come the time of Magnus the Pious, and he dies over in the Battle of Kislev's Gate. When Magnus the Pious comes around at 2300, he binds the empire together again after the Great War against Chaos, and that includes Talabheim, that had been basically separate and had outlawed Sigmarism for 1,000 years or more. They get dragged in, as do the Wolf Emperors up in the north. It's all one big happy empire family again, and the second Magnus dies, it all starts falling apart again. In no time at all, the wasteland has seceded itself. Altdorf is not the capital at this point, and eventually, to try and bring some calm to it all, the House of Second Wilhelm is brought in. That's House Ulrichslichten. That is eventually what will become House Franz, depending upon which version of the history you go with. And we have ourselves Karl Franz's family that takes over. And this is when Altdorf flourishes, arguably to the detriment of other parts of the empire. And then from that point onwards, we eventually arrive at the end times when Altdorf is the largest city inside the empire. Remember, Marienburg is not part of the empire. Marienburg is fat on the wealth of the empire, because everything flows out through Marienburg before it hits the ocean. So Marienburg is, if anything, even bigger than Altdorf. There is a reason that everybody wants to both take it and is absolutely afraid of it. And that's one of them. Its population alone is enormous. So we have ourselves a city at the end of this particular timeline that has gone from being a small tribal bunch of huts all the way through to being at the heart of various huge schisms. Time of 2 emperors, time of 3 emperors, Dark Ages, Magnus the Pious pulls them all back together again, and eventually Karl Franz sits on his throne, thrumming his fingers, going, I'm the man. And that's how you reach today. And it also has sewers.
Yep, amidst many different attempted invaders from other races as well, where you've got like Gorbat Ironclaw infamously destroyed an entire imperial province, poor Solent, before he crashed against the gates of Altdorf and was actually unsuccessful. That's where he pittered out. You also had, of course, Vlad von Karstein made it to Altdorf before his inevitable defeat, and good old Grand the Paunch kind of veered around Altdorf because he's smart. But yeah, it's a bit of it's where the enemies of the empire tend to go to die, which is kind of interesting. Though, yeah, I will say they tend to limp their way out of most of those engagements.
It's fair to say that Grom would have taken Altdorf.
Yeah,
he would have taken Altdorf, but he took Nuln instead and loved it, and did chariot races down in Nuln and had himself a mighty fine time down there. Poor old Nuln, it got properly squashed. And Altdorf, if he had decided that was the next route, would have fallen too, but he didn't, for reasons that are covered in the stream where we discuss Grom. And I think we come up with some really cool reasons for why it didn't pan out in the way that many would expect.
Yeah. So sewers. So Altdorf, as you might imagine, being a city of such size that it really just has not been appropriately depicted, I think, on any of the maps that we have available from Games Workshop these days, has a very massive sewer system. It's basically a city beneath the city. It's so incredibly massive. Built by dwarfs, so it's beautifully constructed, but has kind of started to fall into disrepair over the thousands of years since it was probably built. I imagine it was probably thrown together. Do you think there's be a good rough ballpark of when the dwarfs constructed it?
Right, so there is, and there's multiple versions, which makes it really bloody annoying. So this is what I was talking about right at the very beginning of the stream when we were slowly putting together all the official sources. And if you would like to come and start filling that in along with us, that'd be great, because I am going to make a new map of the place. So I'm going to drop that link in one more time and say that it's being discussed over on our Discord. We'll drop links to that down in the
it's already in the description if you're watching.
I'm super. So that's that one. There's already I'll bring up the link a little later when I'm not talking for the Discord chat as well, where we have open for that. So there's multiple versions. In some versions, all the way back, like during the time of the Grand Cathedral being built. So we're looking at 1,500 years ago, the first sewers were being put in place. But if you turn to novels like, say, Archeon, who moves through the sewers to get up into the Grand Cathedral of Sigmar and have a good old chat with the Grand Theogenist in there. They span it back just like a few years before him. Not that long, in that the grand sewers are relatively new, put in place by the dwarves, like about 100 years before that, which would make them only about 200 years old. So there are multiple versions of the stories. I believe that version brings up something like they were called The Miracle or something like that. It's a wee while since I read that book. So loosely speaking, we have ourselves multiple versions, but we have had sewers of some sort in the city for definitely a long time. It's up to you to decide exactly how long.
Yeah, and the sewers of Altdorf, they're very busy. There's cults and monsters and horrific creatures and mutants and people just trying to get by and all sorts of nasty, horrendous things. Once again, I'll give a nice shout out to good old Warhammer Age of Reckoning, because they actually featured the Altdorf sewers quite heavily as the starter dungeons, in that it was a trio of dungeons where you faced various threats that were lurking beneath the sewers of Altdorf, where you'd fight. Like, one of them was revolving around like a series of mutants and a chaos cult. Another one had to do with Skaven, and a third one had to do with like some demons were manifesting down in all the putrid nastiness down there. But what's what's interesting is that the sewers, if you read Black Library novels, you're going to see the sewers of Altdorf all
A
over
lot.
the goddamn place. And you will find the strangest things down there, from dark elves to genuine to like actual genuine heroes and like little bases, some like Grey College shenanigans happening down there. They feature heavily between like so many different books. If you're looking like just off the top of my head, the Blackheart's omnibus, like the whole third book in Blackheart's is literally just about the sewers of Altdorf, and just how messy they are down there.
Yeah, it's fair to say that whenever a new author moves to Altdorf, one of their first thoughts seems to be, how do I get my characters into some sort of messy shenanigans? I know! The sewers!
Huzzah!
Huzzah! We've got it sorted! Woohoo! And they all take slightly different views. That really does go all the way back to the Conrad series, when we're talking the very first books that were made by Games Workshop Books, all the way back in the day before Black Library existed, before Box Tree took over to do the novels. And even back then, the sewers were seen as the way to get into the city. And the city at that point was very much as I described very early in the stream, the almost medieval version of Warhammer as it was described in those novels. But the sewers are enormous come the end times. They are truly, truly massive. And the reasons behind that are, I think, relatively interesting, given that it is a city that is, if you go with one version, built in islands, you go with another version, it's just built around the confluence of rivers. Whatever version you go with, there is so much water in that water table that it's always going to be dangerous, regardless of what you've got down there, because the places are going to get flooded again and again and again as the river moves into spate. So it's not just that it's dangerous because of all the gribblies down there, it's dangerous because of just the simple threat of water, particularly when you move towards the spring floods that come flushing down, and the rise of the waters over in the brackish marsh. They're not brackish, pardon me, that's salt water. They're blackish, actually. Take the R out, because all the silt that gathers around the Riker marshes is all a very black color because of all the silts that they're taking from further upriver. So yeah, not good. Plus all the effluvium from Nuln and the city of Altdorf all wrapped into those rivers too. It's not going to be the least smelly place in the world.
Yep, and I'll just touch on it very briefly, but it gets worse the further you go down, because Altdorf has a really bad Skaven problem because of Under Altdorf, which is very creatively named. Under Altdorf is quite literally said to be one of, if not the largest undercities in Skavendom, at least the largest in the Empire. It features very prominently in the first book of the Thankful trilogy. So if you want all the nitty-gritty details about Under Altdorf and many of like the sewers and certain aspects, that's a really, really good place to look. But yeah, I mean, just thinking about it, Blackheart's Omnibus, third book features very heavily on that. Bruner the Bounty Hunter has a whole thing about the Altdorf suitors. Thankful,
Bruner ages. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, Thankful's entire first novel takes place in Altdorf. Gotrek and Felix have a novel that features very heavily into Altdorf. So it's and almost all of them have to do with the
window tax riots.
It starts. But yeah, sewers big. So moving from there, I think that's a good place to hop into. If we can pick Andy's brain for a minute about something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but I always like to think about, the gangs of Altdorf, which are a rather notorious element, especially when you consider the docks, because the Altdorf docks are a hive of crime and villainy.
Yeah, the scum and villainy of Altdorf. So they're all bastards in Altdorf, as it said in the very first Conrad book, as I recall, when he slinks in and he hears someone say that, and he cuts the throat of the person that he's moving in, because Conrad's a hero, right? The gangs of Altdorf were a core component when we were planning the Altdorf book, and at this point it was B and I that were building. That's B Sherry. We were building the plan for it. The gangs of Altdorf were going to be a separate supplement, because they're such a core component of how Altdorf expresses itself. And we're not just talking about the gangs that you would expect. So in this case, you're talking your hooks, that are got their gang warfare. There's a bunch of stevedores that are working from the docks of Altdorf, and the fish, who are their great rivals, Hooks and the Fish of Altdorf. But we're also talking about a gang that you might not consider, the Altdorf Watch. The Altdorf Watch that are, unlike almost everywhere in the Empire, a proper policing force. And by that I mean they're not the state army. The state army, which is effectively a full-time standing army, does other jobs because they're not always at war. And the jobs that they tend to do in most of the other cities is act as watch, act as road wardens, patrolling one place to the next, acting as bodyguards for important dignitaries. So if you are a noble and you've got a regiment that you must maintain, all those soldiers have to do something. And they're normally a watchman, and they're not policemen. Don't think of them as policemen. They're just soldiers that stand around and don't police. Their job is to make sure the imperial peace is kept. It's everybody else's job to make sure criminals are caught. It's not their job. Where in Altdorf, they have an actual constabulary. They have a proper watch that stands and looks up, but they are, in many cases, nothing more than thugs themselves. The various knightly orders, the various gangs, there's so many Tillian gangs that kick around in different parts of Altdorf as well. The city is huge. And if you take a look at the real world equivalents that inspired this, so we're looking at, say, look, go watch The Gangs of London, for example. There's some really nice bits in there to give you at least some inspiration if you want to create your own versions. But this all spanned out of the works of, again, Kim Newman, when he was writing Beasts in Velvet, when he was writing Drachenfels, and similar books, where he focused in on the hooks and the fish and the great gang warfares that took place down there, and also the great revolutionary movements that were making their way through. Because another exceedingly important facet of Altdorf is that it is the very heart of imperial politics. It is at the heart of a great confluence of grey magic, which brings suspicion and revolution and riots. Riots happen in Altdorf pretty much, not just yearly, but multiple times every year. And they have to be put down. A new tax gets installed. Riot! A new noble takes over a particular title. Riot! Something terrible is riot! A new army has arrived. Orcs and goblins are coming from the north. Riot! They are constantly, it's a febrile city where nerves are constantly exposed. And again, one of the reasons behind that is because it is so full of magic. It is so full of all the winds of magic, making everybody up a bit. Everyone is dialed to 11 inside Altdorf, which also brings some good things. In that, wizards are common in Altdorf. So common, in fact, that they don't even normally get spat at that much. They don't get frowned at that much. Where everyone might think that the heart of the Empire, the heart of Sigmarism, where there are Sigmarites everywhere who are notorious for their great hatred of all things magical, the actual common folk literally don't give a toss. They have been seeing wizards in and out of their city for the last 200 years, and it has become utterly mundane and commonplace. All of the state regiments in Altdorf and all the ones around it have wizards in them. All the soldiers are used to having wizards beside them. It is just commonplace in that particular city. So not only do we have our riots that are popping up, not only do we have our various gangs constantly at it, not only do we have wizards literally everywhere, a higher concentration of wizards in Altdorf than anywhere else in the old world, we also have a city that has notoriously thick fogs that pull in every single year, particularly as we move into springs and into the autumns, into the fall, as massive fogs come in from the Riker marshes and flood over, and they're big, thick pea supers, again, drawing upon London as a heavy inspiration for its thick pea super fogs. And they also come in wreathed through with Ulgu, and this is when all the knives come out in the dark. Because Ulgu, suspicion is rising everywhere. That grey wind of magic is influencing everything around. And it's when the grey wizards are at both their most powerful and at their most busy, because it's their job in many respects to try and stop the city collapsing in on itself as knives are drawn, the gangs go to warfare, new riots come, the palace itself might be stormed. Do not think of Altdorf as this great peaceful place.
It's a fucking mess.
It is quite literally the opposite. It is alive. It has communities from across the world. It is full of magic. It is full of intrigue. It is full of just basic changeable weather. It is a properly febrile city and is super fun for novels, is super fun for adventure, is super fun for everything. And one of the reasons that lay behind all of that is, again, a mighty spoiler. Because at the very heart of it lies the Enemy Within campaign. And the Enemy Within campaign was always about, why is it like this? And it provided provides an answer.
Sinister thing lurking at the heart of Altdorf.
Absolutely. And so that is, again, another reason why Altdorf is so important. It was made to be important, so that then the linchpins would be there and in a place to be manipulated.
Yep, a city under the city, an undercity. No, such things would be ridiculous. Though it is fun to think about, like, I mean, if you've ever watched documentaries, like they've done like the History Channel or YouTube channels and stuff, where people like to explore the ruins that are underneath modern day cities, where you'll have a lot of cities that have been built on top of cities that have kind of sunk down. Because you consider Altdorf is kind of built around and has had to expand into a bit of a marshland. There are probably parts of Altdorf that have sunk, and new parts of Altdorf are just built on top of it. Until it stops sinking, or at least until it sinks enough where they have to build another part on top of it.
In fact, that is definitely the case, largely because Altdorf is, again, as we mentioned earlier in the stream, based in both London and Edinburgh. Edinburgh is a city of layers, far more representative of Middenheim in terms of how it appears. But just to give you a single anecdote from London, my wife works in banking, and when she went down to, I won't say which particular bank it was, one of the old banks in London, it's got its original old vault there, and literally a key that's this big to get into the vault. And the old ground floor is still visible. So we used to be able to go out in the street, and it's a whole story and a half down below the street level because it's sunk. And Altdorf is older than London. So yes, and it's on arguably far less stable ground. Lots of it has sunk over time and been built on top, and sunk and built on top. So definitely, absolutely.
Yeah, for those of my fellow Americans, like, you know, our country's a baby compared to like Altdorf for the Empire, and we have some notorious cities where they literally built and it sank, and they're like, we'll just build on top of what just sank. Eventually, it'll stop sinking.
It'll be fine, right?
It'll work out fine. So Sig asks, where's that cool map of Middenheim Andy was working on? Has it been finished? If not, is there a nice PDF that can be zoomed in on anytime soon?
It's about half done. We've been using it for our adventure over the course of our play. If you've been watching any of my streams for LAWhammer, you'll see it popping up there. Dive into our Discord, ask over there, and I can show you some extra bits.
Yep. Nasir, I arrived late, so forgive me if this has been asked already. What would be the equivalent of the hood in Altdorf, or the bad part of town, I mean?
There's multiples, and each writer tends to add their own. But if you're looking for just in general an almost universal one, it's the east end of Altdorf.
Yep. Muffin Baskets, this is a bribe. Please upload the recent Lorebeards to Spotify and other audios. I'll do it today. I'll do it today. I'll make it my while I'm eating dinner activity. Turtle Beef.
No, my responsibility.
Yeah, I got it. Turtle Beef, how deep do you think the Skaven Undercity below Altdorf starts and ends? So really interesting thing about Under Altdorf, which is the Skaven city, is that very uniquely for a Skaven city, it actually has like a large lake and riverways running through it, where the water, there's like an underwater or underground basin essentially, which is very common in our world, where there's like a river beneath the Reich where it connects to like the groundwater and it flows through, and the Skaven have built up around it. So if you think about in our world, how they're, especially, I know we talk about this a lot in the US, especially nowadays with like water rights and a lot of arguments about that out west, where there are cities where you often have a city and then you have like your sewers and stuff. And then deep below that, there's like giant underwater cavern systems where all the groundwater is. That's where Under Altdorf is. So it's a good bit down there. I can't give you specific numbers, but using that information, you could probably look up some scientific research about like where groundwater tends to be in relation to many of the cities that we've built, and you'd probably have a good idea for where Under Altdorf relatively may be.
Yeah, Altdorf is particularly fascinating because the surrounding land is so waterlogged. Because we are in the middle of a giant marsh, and the Altdorf flats are on all sides. This great big, as I say, black boggy area. Meaning that Altdorf itself, which is built on firm land, is relatively unique as to exactly what's going on there to make that land firm. As for the water table to be different, there is to be investigated. The various stories that have dived down beneath Altdorf often go very deep. So you can go almost as deep as you want when it comes to Altdorf. When we were building our version of it, and we were we were almost 3/4 of the way through writing that book. But there was a reason for why Altdorf had an undercity and it wasn't just one gigantic marsh, because if it was just a big marsh down there, there would be no under Altdorf. So it requires some extra detail to make more sense of it all. So yeah, there has to be something here there to make the land more firm.
Yep. Okay. Turtle Beef again. So, taking Andy off the cuff, could you each list 3 gangs that might exist? Might exist.
Might is interesting.
And Altdorf, and briefly describe what they might do. So three may be a lot for a might. I'll bargain with you and say like maybe 1 or 2. But for me, one of my favorite tropes that I believe appeared in Go Check It Felix, I want to say it was Manslayer. Technically, this is a known, but it's one of the things I really, really love. It's something I talked with Andy Leask about. If you go back to Lorebeards right before Andy joined, and Lorebeards evolved into its much more beautiful modern form, is that when I was chatting with Andy Leask, one of my favorite tropes is the idea of taking halflings and showing how horrifically ruthless and dangerous they can be despite their small stature, and how because of their culture and the way that they develop relationships, they are prime candidates to make some really nightmarish fucking gangs.
LAWhavens.
Yeah, the LAWhavens. And running with that idea on Altdorf, and like really, because they're just in Altdorf, but exploring those particular sects of that, the halflings really and truly would be one of the most lethal gangs, because A, they're going to be very underestimated, and B, their family ties are so intense.
And like, so tight.
Yeah, like think of like your favorite like the Godfather movies and stuff and how they approach family, and dial that up to like 30. And that's going to be your halflings. And there's a lot more of them. Yeah, that was the one I was going to first drop on as well, because the LAWhavens are perfect for this. Yeah. So, and if you played like the Witcher games and you've dealt with like some of the really nasty gangs, like once again, but dial it even up even more.
Yeah, always consider that your dial for these things always has an extra slot to go to 11 when you're doing Warhammer. What can you do to just make it one step worse? So we're going to go for might. So let's look at a couple of different things. First, often when people look at Altdorf, they think of the docklands that are spread through the city itself, but most of those are private docks. The only way to land there is if you have got a license, or if you're working for one of the merchant houses that is allowed to dock there, meaning that the vast majority of the docking happens out in the Reichsport, which is on the other side of the city, past the confluence and on the Marienburg side of the Reich. And it's a big, wide open expanse, as we discussed already earlier in the stream, where all of the naval people are. So that area is alive with trade. It's like the center of trade for Altdorf, and it's not actually in Altdorf, which is super fun. So you've got the Reichsport that's sitting out there. So let's go for one unexpected gang time. Press gangers. Because you've got to get yourself crew for your good old Imperial fleet. And as anyone knows who's read the Shades of Empire articles for the Imperial First Fleet, they're not very good at their ships anyway. They really don't care if they've got good crew or not. So press ganging people into taking the Emperor's shilling and getting into the boats. There's an unexpected gang type as they wander around with their cautious doing unexpected damage, and people waking up finding themselves on a ship to Lustria. Yeah, there's all sorts of cool things you can do with that.
Yeah, and speaking of Lustria, another thing that you would be very likely to see in Altdorf that would be a lot of fun is between the Imperial Zoo, the colleges of magic, and just a bunch of rich assholes living in the city, along with like people from foreign nations and embassies, the exotic creature trade would be insane in Altdorf. Of people peddling illegal creatures, dangerous creatures, either because they want them as pets, or they want them for like alchemy, or they want them for research. Like the gangs that would revolve around the trade of magical or even mundane but exotic creatures would be nuts in Altdorf.
Totally. I mean, we pulled that out as a potential story point in our Middenheim section of our LAWhammer streams because exotic creatures are awesome. So yeah, people are going to be trying to get their hands on them in a variety of different ways and also faking it, claiming that they've got the next great thing. So yeah, I think that's probably enough because we don't want to turn the entire stream into all the different things. But Altdorf, I think, if I was going to sum it up, it is literally the heart of the empire. So if you can imagine it, it's probably there. And the darker you think is probably nowhere near as dark as it gets because people are horrible. Really horrible. Look at the real world. Just take a moment to look at the real world and realize you don't need dark gods and horrible things for horrible things to happen. But this is a world where they actually also have all of that. So yeah, there's some pretty nasty stuff.
What is Andy/Sotek's favorite part of Altdorf?
Part of Altdorf. I'll let you go first. Unless you
I would say for me, it's probably just because I have such like fond memories of like screwing around with it and having a really good time with it. It's probably the sewers of Altdorf for me. And they pop up in so many Black Library books. Like as someone that once again didn't play the role play game until much later in life, like within like the last 10 or so years. And so I didn't have a lot of the like enemy within relationship with like Upper Altdorf. It doesn't get talked about as much in like just the army books and stuff like that. So the sewers of Altdorf, a lot of really crazy adventures take place down there. And in Warhammer Online, I was someone that would tend to like level a character and then get kind of bored with them. So I'd make a new character and then get bored with them and make a new character and get bored with them and make a new character. So I spent a lot of time in those sewer dungeons and I really fell in love with them because of that.
Yeah,
so yeah,
understandable.
What about you, Andy?
There are so many different bits of Altdorf. That's one of the problems with doing a stream like this one, because we could probably do streams about each one of the various districts and still have like 3 hours worth of easy chat. So I'm loosely going to say a district because it has formed for me so many unique and interesting stories, not just inside the lore as it stands, but within my own games. And that's in general the east end of Altdorf. And not just because that's where we put the Hafenstad when we were very first organizing that out. And that's where the Bright College is. That's where the Grey College is. That's where some of the worst gangs are, the tallest rookeries. In various games, it literally gets entirely burnt down in some stories as well. It's a truly crime-ridden mess. And it's this big, huge pile of horror show that I really rather quite enjoy. So probably the East End, although I do have a very, very fond spot for one of the temples that we were building that we never published because we didn't finish that book for Grandfather Reich. And for an enormous temple for the Order of the Twin-Tailed Orb that we were working on that was proper chapter house. That was super.
I will always have a very fond memory of the East End of Altdorf in that in Warhammer Online it's depicted beautifully, but there was a really fun event you could get where I remember running around as a little baby character, and there was they made the capital cities like Altdorf and the Inevitable City really exciting, and there were lots of public events and stuff. And one of the events that could happen is that if a series of events went off that players did, basically like a plague would sweep through the East End where all the poor people are and stuff. People get really sick. And if you played it through to its finale, which required a bunch of people working together, it would spawn a greater demon of Nurgle stomping around the East End of Altdorf, causing havoc, which was so fun.
I loved that game.
Yeah, it had its flaws, but it really
had its flaws, but it
had some beautiful moments when it did well. Laughing God, I'm unfamiliar with the Imperial Dragon. Can we get some detail on it in its relationship with Altdorf and its people? Okay, we will do the Imperial Zoo next, but let me get through the rest of these little things real quick because it's fun to talk about. Chris Zerkovich made a little joke when hearing Thorgrim say "one rag" that it's his wife's name, and he's grumbling for her to grab his axe or something. Haha! I am now curious what the word means. So one rag. Oh my gosh, I would have to grab my Kozilid dictionary, which I do not have right next to me.
I trust that's something he says in the game.
Yeah, it's something that he'll yell sometimes when you give him an order or interact. That he's yelling angrily. It's definitely not his wife. But
I'm gonna have to go check that one up. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
yeah, Chris,
That's really annoying. Actually,
I-
you've annoyed me, Chris. Thanks. I'm now gonna have to go figure that one out. God
while I
dang
was
it.
doing that, Sig, any notable Bretonian things in Altdorf? One of my players is questing that, and the other a Bordelot wine merchant bard. They would have a huge embassy in Altdorf.
Oh, the old embassy. Oh man.
Something that's actually interesting to consider as well is when you've heard us talk a lot about how Altdorf is built along a waterway, and it kind of almost sort of functions in size and scope as kind of like being a lake where things gather. There would be probably a chapel somewhere dedicated to the lady.
Yeah, I mean, we popped a chapel all the way over in Ehrengrad, so yeah, there's going to be probably multiple chapels.
Yeah, because there would have been famous knights that have passed through the city, maybe even taken up residence, or maybe even died fighting there among some of the various like big epic battles. So like the odds of there being a Grail chapel somewhere in Altdorf is extremely high.
So, as a small aside, in the old version of Altdorf, the Bretonian ambassador was a dwarf who was a naturalized Bretonian dwarf who liked giant fat women and going to see them in the street, the 100 Taverns. And he liked just sitting there watching big women do their shows in front of him.
A dwarf of culture is what you're saying.
He was sent by the Bretonians as an insult because they had absolutely no time for the emperor or the empire as a whole, and they sent their joke dwarf. And it was, I would argue, a truly terrible character, while simultaneously an interesting joke, but not the best joke.
Yeah,
that was before our modern version of what
I was going to say. The idea of Lewin Lanker sending someone like that is mind-boggling.
Yeah, beyond that. But yes, every single one of the old world nations have embassies, but not just them. So do all the grand provinces. Do not think of the empire as one big homogenous whole. It's not. All of the grand provinces, with all of its elector counts, have got real interest in the capital, because that's where the Volkshalle is, attached to the Imperial Palace, and that is where all the great laws for the empire are passed, and the prime estates get to vote on those laws, and the elector counts themselves are effectively other kings. The emperor is first king among kings, like the dwarves in many respects. So they all have their own embassies there. They all have their own political reasons to be there as well. So don't just think of this as, oh, this is a cool place where we could drop Cathedrons. No, really think about it. Make a super fascinating, interesting, say, Stirland embassy, okay, representing, say, the Hout Andersons or someone else. That would be super, super fun as well.
Yeah, and in a city like Altdorf, there would probably like basically almost be like a Bretonian district, where probably like a lot of people from Bretonia would live, and you would have, of course, people like it for your characters, a questing knight and a wine merchant / bard. There would definitely be some of the probably the most influential wine merchants of Bretonia having little shops and stores and stuff where they're hawking their wares and trying to be the best in Altdorf, which would likely probably lead to some great shenanigans if you really want to lean into it, of how they war among one another and with the Altdorf groups that are also making their own wine, or representatives from across the empire. And then for your questing night, a quiet. And the thing is, you could have fun with. There would probably be like the chapel to the lady that's very ostentatious, and the Bretonians make a big show of it to try and show how the lady's better than the empire's gods and how they should consider the lady. But there might also be a very nice little Grail chapel that's tucked away that nobody's really keenly aware of, except for some old dude who's a very old knight that's been watching over it for a long time. You can have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, the idea of a little version of each one of the old world nations is not just an old idea for Altdorf. It's been established for ages. So yes, a Bretonian quarter, a Kislev quarter, a Talabheim quarter, a Talabek land quarter, an Ostland quarter, a Middenland quarter. All of the individual provinces and all of the old world realms are all there, plus further beyond as well.
Yeah, and also for Chris, for the Zerkovich thing, it just occurred to me, I am 90% sure what Thorgrim is saying is he's not saying one rag, he's saying one wrong, but the way he's shouting
one wrong, and that sounds much more likely.
I think it's because of the voice actor's accent and that he's yelling. It sounds like he's saying something in Kozlov, but I'm 95% sure he's yelling one wrong. But it's just the way his accent is.
That's it. That's it. One wrong. One wrong. One wrong. That sounds more. I'm gonna have to listen to it. I've got my computer already almost ready to go.
I've thought about that in the past, but I'm pretty sure that's what he's actually yelling. Because
good.
there's no text to go along with it. He only yells it in battle. Jonathan Scott, what would an Empire army themed around the gangs of Altdorf? An Empire army themed around the gangs of Altdorf look like? In real life, the U.S. Army has issues with gang affiliation, so Reichman probably does too. Yeah, well, like he's talked with the Watch. But yeah, like there would be issues within the state troops as well, where you would have genuine gangs within the Altdorf garrisons and the Altdorf state troops. Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, because you've got to remember though that unlike the real world, where officers can come from any background, in the Warhammer and the Empire, all the officers are noble. The commissioned ranks are noble. So infiltrating the army is actually hard, and if you want to get into a position of authority. That doesn't mean that all officers are noble, because some of them, for one reason or other, will be promoted beyond their expected position, but the vast majority, almost all of them, are noble, meaning that it's very difficult to get up to that position. Having said that, though, I think that you'd be looking for lots of yeah, I mean, you could see lots of ways that they could come in, and I'd be using, I mean, some of the old Marienburg models that were released would work quite well for, say, the fish.
A lot of if you messed around with a lot of the Mordheim models will be
perfect. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. The old Marienburg ones for Mordheim, they'd work really nicely for that. And yeah.
Hammond, I'm not even gonna read that. I'm just gonna move on. Mandat says one rog where, one being a prefix indicating question, but one rog is listed as meaning where. I mean, yeah, that could be it. It'd be a weird thing for him to shout and there not be anything else included.
I'm looking forward to listening to this one,
but we'll look into that. We will definitely look into that. So Imperial Zoo is, I believe, where we promised we'd go.
Okay, Zoo, interesting.
So the Imperial Zoo is famous for a lot of different reasons. It's a zoo, which is very, very cool. It has lots of different little gribblies and creatures that are brought to it. There are kind of some fun. It changes depending on the author. They will go wild with what kind of creatures are contained there. Some of them will treat it more like a typical, like, oh yeah, you know, they've got like an exhibit for squigs, and maybe they've got an exhibit for like the silver apes of the Southlands, or they've got an exhibit for like these creatures from Lustria or whatever. If you read Cubicle 7 put out a book that's called The Imperial Zoo, which is kind of treated more as like their monster index. But it's got some fun stories, and there's like some Lustrian dinosaurs there and some other random creatures. But the big one, the big two that are super duper famous are Deathclaw hangs out there a lot. That's where his kind of, I don't know what you would call the home of a griffin, but that's where he spends a lot of his time when he's not being ridden by Karl Franz, which if you played The Enemy Within, there are some things you can glean based on what Deathclaw is up to. But the other one, the super famous one that a lot of people learn about and go, the what now, is the Imperial Dragon.
The Imperial Dragon.
Which is, from a lore perspective, he's a bit of a clusterfuck, to be honest. Because he's in modern, the like 8th edition, 7th edition, 6th edition writings, he is a literal walking contradiction of that. They treat him as a primordial ancient creature while also saying that he's a baby.
Yeah, so there's some big problems here. When I was planning the bestiary book, I was going to fix this because there's an actual issue or 4 or 10. There's quite a few of them. The Imperial Zoo, the Empire Zoo, was the place that got me my first writing gig mapping gig, for Warhammer. Because I was so unimpressed with some of the maps for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that I sent in a map that I did in an evening for the Empire Zoo. And I was like, look, I did this in a single freaking evening, and I know I could do better. Bloody hell, just give me a job. So I got a job. And that one's if you do a web search for the Imperial Zoo, the Empire Zoo, my map's probably still sitting out there somewhere because it got shared during Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2's time quite a lot, because it stood as the template that was used for a variety of things at the time. Now, the dragon in particular doesn't make sense. So we were going to be rewriting it as a holdover from the elves. It was something that was down there underneath, basking in the great flow of magic that was passing through the area, that was originally put in place in that area by effectively the old ones, because part of the geomantic web that was later hacked by the elves as they were building the great vortex that was going to be sucking magic out of the world. And it was going to be a primordial dragon from that era, matching the primordial stories. And the alternate stories saying that he was just a baby were literally that stories. And that was the way we were going to run with it. But it's a contradiction as it currently stands. And it all comes from the great Emperor Dragon that was originally released all the way back when for 3rd edition of Warhammer, where it was released and it crept into the 4th edition of Warhammer as a monster choice that could be taken for the Empire army, a great fuck off dragon. And that was attached to the Imperial Zoo as to where it may be. And various writers have attempted to explain why that is the case more than once. But if you go back and you look at the original advert for the Imperial Dragon, it's quite funny. You can cast magic and everything. He's pretty awesome. It's a very, very old piece of lore.
Yeah, it's funny because the Imperial Dragon of that edition would go on to inspire the Emperor class dragons of 8th edition because they copy what he's capable of, and that they're these big scary dragons that can cast magic. But the Imperial Dragon lost that ability.
It's actually hilarious just how the lore has gone in little spirals and circles with this one. Super fun.
Yeah. So, but anyway, he's there, and like what Andy was saying, there's these weird things where, like, I want to say in like 8th edition or 7th edition, there's like an explicit mention of like when they found the egg of the Imperial Dragon and brought it to the Imperial Zoo, and it's like not that long ago. Whereas when he's actually described, and the very, very rare occasion where he's like explicitly mentioned and talked about, he's treated more like he's thousands of years old. And has been lurking around Altdorf for years and is just kind of like happy to just chill because people bring him food and stuff.
I mentioned in the stream some time ago that I used that dragon as a core plot point in one of my games of Warhammer fantasy roleplay as a 10-year campaign. I might actually post that story just because it's proper daft. And it's basically the dragon opening and closing its eye over the course of several thousand years and hearing different snippets. And most of the snippets are in languages that it doesn't understand because it's like Old Unberrigan or some equivalent, until eventually it moves into modern Reichspiel. And eventually the dragon wakes up because what was in my game at that point, the Supreme Matriarch of the Bright Order arrives. And he believes that it's actually his ancient elven, let's say, companion. And wakes up thinking she's here. Yes, comes out, and literally the poor dragon's heart is broken when it finds out that it's this tiny little woman wielding the same staff.
That's super sad.
Yeah, super sad.
Bummer there, Andy.
Yeah. But sad stories are good, right?
Yeah. There's one of the interesting things about it is like they throw in some really hilarious, just very random tidbits about the dragon throughout like the later editions, like 7th and 8th edition especially, where like you have this ancient dragon that is talked about as like this, he's got this cold alien mind and he doesn't really tolerate anyone, but just everyone sort of, they feed him and leave him alone, and people like gawk at him from the far away glass or whatever. But for some reason, Karl Franz, being the badass he is able to establish some kind of rapport with this creature, and he can ride it into battle. He never does,
Karl Franz,
which always leads to people asking, why the fuck does he ride a griffin when he could ride a dragon? And it's because, to be frank, they just were like, oh, this is cool, and we'll carry it over from editions. But there has never been a model where Karl Franz rides on the Imperial Dragon, and there's never been a story about him riding on the dragon. So it kind of leads me to this hilarious idea of like, they almost give you like an alternate universe version, but it almost reads more like Karl Franz was able to just successfully walk into its exhibit and like pat it on the head and walk back. Everyone's like, he conquered it. He mastered it. Look at him go.
Yeah, it's a holdover from the 4th edition of Warhammer. Where the monster choices that you had for the Empire army were much more varied than you get today. You had everything in there, from various swarms of creatures that had been pulled in place by the colleges of magic to dragons. And those dragons were not just for the Emperor. The Emperor rode Deathclaw in the 4th edition. Any character, so just your Imperial General or a wizard, could ride a fuck off dragon, which was proper powerful. But that got changed over the course of the editions as they went, no, we're going to keep the dragons as a thematic choice for certain species. So the high elves get the dragons, while all the dragons in the Empire, even though we have said multiple times that Amber Wizards and various other wizards combined them, you can't do it. So, hey! They just left it for
for them to just immediately turn around for the Storm match and be like, oh, you can have dragons again.
Really?
Yeah. And then it's like, oh yeah, it turns out the Tomb Kings were riding their own species of dragons.
And
Elspeth. Empire, yeah.
Elspeth, one dragon. Look, she's got a dragon too.
Yeah, hilarious. So. But the good old consistency of the Warhammer universe. But one of the things that's interesting is that the dragon also makes a kind of a hilarious appearance in the end times, because one author was like, oh, this dragon's really cool, I should use it. And then the remaining authors just completely forgot about it.
What dragon?
Because like in the Fall of Altdorf,
we're gonna have to do our second stream at some point, just so we can lay into it.
Sometime this year. So yeah, there's a whole scene where a pretty major villain. So the Harbinger, for those that don't know their Beastman lore, the Harbinger is a fairly big deal. He is a Beastman character that's mentioned in the 7th edition book that they released, but he's like scattered throughout older lore. But he's like one of the big bad Beastmen of the Empire, and the Harbinger is like destroying everything, and he's like horrifying. He's like the big Beastman character that's still alive at this point during the fall of Altdorf, and he chases Gregor Martark, who's the Supreme Patriarch at this point, the Patriarch of the Amber College, down into the Imperial Zoo, and they get to the dragon's enclosure, and basically the dragon wakes up because it smells the Harbinger and all these Beastmen in his chamber, and he just instantly obliterates all of them. He just brings fire, kills everybody, and he looks at Gregor Martark, and Martark's like, thanks, bro. And then the dragon goes back to sleep and never appears for the rest of the end times.
And that's it. Done.
He's like, I contributed. I'll just sit here in this Nurgle-infested hellhole, and I'm not going to do anything else.
I'm actually quite interested to go and try and find my story, because as I recall, I think Archaon was trying to wake up and taint the dragon. I'll have to go see if I can find it.
That would be very on brand for Archaon, especially
it really wouldn't it?
His AOS edition version, because he's really big on corrupting big creatures by that point. So anyway, that's the Imperial Zoo. A lot of really fun stories can be told there, because if you want a creature from like somewhere else in the world to appear in the Empire, that's the most likely place for them to make a random appearance. Because I mean, just think about in our world how often like countries will gift exotic animals to one another as like a diplomatic thing, where like China's got its whole like panda program, where like you would have that with the Imperial Zoo, where you'd have like creatures from Nippon or Grand Cathay or Estalia or Tulare, these kind of more exotic places in the Empire, would very likely have exhibits in the Imperial Zoo, because they would be gifted to Karl Franz or a previous emperor, and they'd be like, all right, cool, let's put this in the zoo and maybe try and have a breeding program and hope it works out. So you could have a lot of fun with shenanigans that happen because of that, or whether your party works at the zoo. Like, yeah, you could have an entire campaign about being employees at the Imperial Zoo, to be honest.
That was actually going to be what the Beastry book was going to offer when we first planned it. It was going to offer 6 pre-made characters that were all effectively zoologists of different types. One of them a wizard, one of them something else.
That would be so fun.
Those were the characters that were being set up for Pass of the Old Ones, because they're going to be basically commissioned to go to the other side of the world. And that was going to be a super fun way of leading to the
I can see how they cannibalized that idea for the Imperial Zoo book they ended up releasing, because they did something similar.
But instead of having, because
but it doesn't build into a grand campaign, unfortunately.
Yeah, quite. It was going to be TS, me, B, and Andy Lease that was writing that book, and it ended up just being TS because we don't liked out of there. So poor old TS had to do the whole thing by himself. I'm really sorry for him.
I will say this. I do like this comment a lot. This is where Nakai spends all his free time when he's not saving the lizardmen. He goes back to the Imperial Zoo and just goes back. They're like, oh man, this gator, he just vanishes sometimes. It's fucking weird. That being said, that actually reminds me, the fact that I don't think I've ever seen it written anywhere. There has to be Croxagores in the Altdorf sewers, because gators in the sewers, at least for American culture, is such a fucking thing. There are croc scores in the sewers.
Yeah, I mean it's a done deal. That should be an adventure hook in any Altdorf book. We had 3 of them lined up, as I recall. One of them was directly tied to an entity that we were going to call the Bog Emperor. But yeah.
Korenshima, how's the real estate market in Altdorf? More importantly, where's Gelt's apartment in Altdorf? What kind of housing can he afford with his salary?
So Gelt obviously is in the Gold College. Now, depending upon which version of the Empire you go with, if you go with the older version, the Gold College is in the central part of Altdorf. On the in one version, it's on a literal island. At the far end of it, right beside the dwarf quarter. In another version of it, it's basically jutting out over the combined Talabek and Reich, looking out over into the Reichsport. Doesn't really matter which version you go with. It's right by water, and the mess that the Gold College leaves behind, this swirling mixture of colors in the water, as all of the industry that they've done piles out from there. And he's got apartments that stand over the River Reich and are attached to the college. That's that. But he also is mentioned in multiple places of having his own apartments inside the city itself, which would be over in the west end of the city if you want to place him. So that'd be to the west of the Imperial Palace, where he has his own effective estate, and it is a target repeatedly of various gangs because of the great wealth that apparently lies within.
Yeah,
and the idiot though.
Yeah, you'd have to be really fucking stupid to try and steal from a wizard, B, a gold wizard who can send his money.
It's in one of the I think it's the 5th edition of Warhammer. One of the core stories is a thief attempting to get into a gold wizard's house, and it goes as well as you'd imagine.
Yep, that's a good way to end up as a statue real fucking fast.
Yep. As I recall, it's a big gold cage that lands down at him. Makes me want to go find it. I think that's Warhammer Magic 5th edition. I think that one.
Yeah, and as far as the real estate market, actually would probably be a really interesting thing to explore, considering how much of a present concern that is for modern day us. Altdorf would probably have a fascinating and cutthroat real estate market.
Yeah, you got to imagine that a lot of the sections, lots of Altdorf are owned over very old leases and are effectively almost small duchies in and of themselves held within the city. The Halskrugs still own a small section inside by Gwellner Hill. Gwellner Hill was named after the Gwellner family that used to rule there. But Altdorf, as it spread, different nobles took control of different parts of it. And the current family that rules as the princes, they're basically new. They've come into a lot older families who own sections of it. So it's not just going to be complicated, it's going to be interesting as well. So it's a part of the makeup of Altdorf that I fear has not been really well dived into with any of the actual books, because they generally just go with, well, it's all the emperors, isn't it?
Lindsay, hello.
Hi, Lindsay.
Yeah, talking about the dragon story. Elemental Exposure. Hey, Andy, if you got to choose to have a cameo in Total War, what kind of species / hero / lord would you want to appear as?
Oh, I'd do anything, me. I'm easy. I mean, as ridiculous as that is to say, I'm really easy. I could do anything. Obviously, I'm Scottish, so anything with a Scottish accent would go down well. I don't know.
I think the only thing that reliably would have that kind of accent would be probably a huntsman. Like a huntsman general or a dwarf. Yeah. The huntsman general have very Scottish accents.
Yeah, I need to think on that one, Elemental Exposure. Because totally. I adore Warhammer as a whole, so I don't really have a favorite. So being anywhere at all is for me just great.
We need to get Andy a reference character in there. They like to throw those in. Lidor. A clusterfuck in my Warhammer lore? Unbelievable. I quite like that the Imperial Dragon is a giant, weird, fun mess in and outside the world. It is fitting. Chat says, Andy should be the Empire captain that Balthazar Gelt starts his campaign with. His starting hero. Rude.
Just bring up this comment from Lindsay, actually. Oh, sorry, I just there. Would it not be like London City, mostly leased from a few rich families? That's exactly what I was thinking, Lindsay. Where you would have several old families that have long ruled in and around Altdorf, and everyone else is leasing from them, and probably including the Imperial Palace. It's all a complicated web of Oh no! In fact, the more I think about it, the more that would be really cool. You could write some really good stories from that.
Yeah, you could have a lot of fun. Yeah, real estate would be fun stuff. See, beforehand, as I alluded to earlier, Krimlo is Gelt's landlord. Krimlo, man, if he's leaving,
he gets around.
Patriarchs, man, he's got a good business going. Jonathan Scott, Sotek, to be fair, let's have a breeding program and hope it works out. It's just the ordinary way the Empire chooses political leadership. You're not wrong. Yeah. Something great families of magic, something. So, okay, we've hit on the zoo, we've hit on the sewers. Do you want to talk very briefly, just because we have to start answering Discord questions here in a minute?
We do. Look at the time.
Is there anything you'd like to hit on when it comes to, say, the Imperial Palace or the Cathedral of Sigmar?
Okay, so very loosely, I think the church and state, to sum it up in a pithy way, is at the very heart of Altdorf's power. The Emperor rules from Altdorf, but as Prince of Reichland, he also rules from Altdorf. And there are so many exceedingly powerful bodies surrounding him to support him in that particular job, and also to get as much as they possibly can out of it for themselves as they are helping him do that particular job. Whether it's the Council of Reichland, some of the most important, influential nobles, not just in the Reichland, but in the old world, that are effectively responsible for running Reichland. They run Reichland. The prince doesn't. The prince barely does anything. Karl Franz is far too busy to do that, making them exceedingly powerful individuals. Then you've got the Council of State. The Council of State is the group that effectively advises the emperor how to be the emperor, what is good, what is bad, ranging from his brothers on that for a significant amount, but less said about that, the better. The Warlord of Verena sits on both of those councils, and Agnetha Born is enormously powerful. Loosely speaking, we have some of the most important politicians in the old world all gathered inside this city, power broking. And they are brokering power with individual grand provinces, with other old world nations, and they are exceedingly. Oh, you're just looking for the old one that you're looking for?
I was trying to find this particular comment. Sorry, finish your.
They are exceedingly powerful. So we have all of them, but then we also have the Imperial Palace, where obviously all the great diplomatic events of the day occur. But attached to that, you've got the Volkshalle, the People's Hall, and in the Volkshalle, all of the most important noble families across the empire gather to basically judge anything that the emperor does. And if they don't like it, they vote it down, because the emperor is not all powerful in the empire, contrary to many beliefs. When it comes to matters of war, he has many rights. When it comes to matters of coinage, he has many rights. But he doesn't have absolute power. He's not like, say, Boris Todbringer up in Middenheim. And the same stands for being the Prince of Reichland. The Prince of Reichland shares power with the Reichland Diet. Now, that's not somebody that's losing a bit of weight. The Reichland Diet is a large council of all the prime estates of Reichland. That's the most important. It's about 60, 70 nobles who all gather in Reichland, and they look at the emperor and they say, we want to pass this law. And the emperor can say, yes, it's passed. The law becomes, or he can say no, and it doesn't happen. And the emperor can easily say, I want this to happen. And they do a vote and go, yeah, no. They share power. He doesn't have the power of Reichland. They share the power, which means that the Reichland Council, who are advising the emperor, running everything that is put in place by the great Reichland Diet, have an enormous amount of power, far more so than Karl Franz himself. And the same is the case for the empire as a whole. Karl Franz does not hold that much power. The power is held by the individual grand provinces. What is held, though, is the right for war, which is a big thing. The state armies can fall underneath his control whenever the empire as a whole declares war. But even that, to a degree, is curtailed. Loosely speaking, on the state side, we have everything important in the empire happening here, and it is not Karl Franz that runs it. It's everybody that runs it. It's a political tangled web of Ulgu, the Grey Wind of Magic that loves this stuff, going wild. And Altdorf is at the heart of all of these politics. On the flip side, we have the Cult of Sigmar, which is quite simply the flip of it. Over with the Grand Theogenist, he is the ruler.
Yeah, he's the boss.
He speaks on behalf of Sigmar. He has only one rival, Karl Franz, who is Sigmar's representative on the throne. And that is the tension that he has to deal with. He is arguably the most important figure. There's only one figure in all of the old world who is probably more powerful than the Grand Theogenist, and that is the leader of the cult of Myrmidia. Because all of Tilia and Estalia falls underneath their sway, plus Myrmidia is all over the Empire and Araby and elsewhere, all the way up into Norsca as well. Their cult is so much bigger than Sigmar's. Sigmar is only in the Empire. But the heart of Sigmar's beating cult is Altdorf in the Grand Cathedral. And it is an enormously complicated network, again, of different orders, different groups, but they are all loosely focused into Altdorf. And everybody is, and the cult, supposed to make a pilgrimage there to the birthplace of Sigmar himself. The cathedral is supposedly built directly over it.
Totally is.
Point. Totally, it definitely happened. The point where the Greenskins assaulted and attempted to kill Sigmar before he was even born. And obviously that didn't work. It's supposedly inside this Grand Cathedral. And they're all supposed to go there. But loosely speaking, these two figures, Karl Franz, who is at the head, but he is almost a figurehead. And then we have the Grand Theogenist, who is not a figurehead. He actually holds the power, but he's surrounded by thousands of Sigmarites, all of whom won't necessarily agree with him. It isn't very easy being at the top. So there we have cult, there we have state, and both are enormously complicated. But when it comes to the Empire, this is where all of the power is currently held in Altdorf. So if you want to, for example, destabilize the Empire, this is the place that you go.
Yep. A couple of fun little additions to that. If you want to hear more about like the Grand Cathedral and what's going on there and stuff, go check out our LAWhammer stream. That was actually super duper fun. And
I'd forgotten about that one. That's a good one.
And if you're like, oh wow, that Vox Hollow thing sounds like super fucking cool. If you go watch, you should just watch LAWhammer from the beginning. But if you go watch the New Year's episode that they did at the start of the new year of LAWhammer, you could see it happening, and it's super duper fun. It's a great episode. And you can see
about that too.
Yeah. Super fun because you also get to see a couple special characters show up, like Karl Franz and the Reichsmarshal and Thyris Gorman, and it's a good time.
A certain dodgy Johann.
Yeah, watching the rapport that Andy designed between the Reichsmarshal and the Supreme Patriarch Thyris Gorman is fucking hilarious. Two old dudes that they have words. But let's start, Chris. My Wolfrip party is a mercantile party, so is there any interesting tidbits or names of trade companies / families based in Altdorf I should know about? Thank you. Ooh, a lot.
So many.
A fun fact is that you could find a lot about the Jaegers. Felix Jaeger's family is huge in Altdorf. They're big boys. Felix's dad was a scary motherfucker. His brother took over the business after his dad is killed, though whether or not you will have that happen by the time you're playing your campaign depends on what year you start in. Because I think Felix's dad doesn't die until like roughly like 2515, 2516-ish ballpark. Depending on which source you look at. So the Jaegers, you can drop them in if your players are like big Warhammer people to be like, oh fuck. And then you're like, yeah, no, it's not the cool Jaeger, it's his brother.
So I'm not going to go to specifics here because you tend to find that when it comes to any of the mercantile ones, they're only important in single books. So you might find that in one novel, one family is brought up. In the next novel, they're forgotten about. It's a completely different one. The next novel, they're forgotten about. It's another different one. You go to the roleplay books, and they just create new ones for reasons that I don't understand when there's so many in the books already. So loosely, I would instead suggest just take a look at, just think of a city that you know, a big city, and then say, so who are the important businesses? And then realizing that if you look into it, there's hundreds. And they're all huge. And that is Altdorf. There are hundreds of families. and they're all huge, and every single one has got its own tale. So I would not limit myself by trying to cameo someone in per se, but I would definitely look at it as a whole and say, what do I want to do to try and give the idea that this place is enormous?
Yep, and I do want to give, I'm just picking out this comment in particular, but YouTube chat, I do want to say, I do believe y'all figured it out, that he is quite literally saying one rug, because he only says it on the campaign map when he's selected to move around, so Thorgrim is likely saying where to, but he's shouting it in Castellid.
Where to go?
Yeah, so that is what he's saying. He's saying, where are we going? Or where to give orders. Korinshima. Oh no, I already answered this.
Done that one already.
Yep. I forgot that I went back to do super chats. And last one here for bits. This reminds me of the privy counselor of some English monarchs. Their duty was to clean behind of their king after trolley visits, but it was very desired role since you have a lot of one-on-one time with the king and thus influence with him.
Yeah, and you've also got to remember that roles like that were often just code for they were lovers. And you'll find that there's a certain amount of prissiness, particularly that rose up during the Victorian era and afterwards from historians when they looked back and they were like, well, no, that couldn't be the case because no, they were often lovers, and it was a way to give their lovers very close, intimate time with the person
they
involved.
Were roommates.
yeah, they were just pillow friends. And it's not entirely uncommon that was the case. And I'm not saying that's always the case because it wasn't. But I would look to history in that way and try to think about what was actually going on, because whenever you look into, say, queer theory, you suddenly realize there was a lot that's just been written out, and if you look between the lines, you see that it's still all there.
What about Luigi and Salvatore's for like big merchant guys? Yeah, these are
Luigi and Salvatore's are everywhere. L&S, you can't go wrong with good old L&S, and they've got multiple branches in Altdorf. Several of them.
Kroxigor's in the sewers. Sotek approves CA design. Yeah, down in the sewers, in the shit where it belongs, because that's how I feel about those designs. Got him. All right, so
you're on fire.
All right, let's blow
questions.
Discord questions real fast. Hawk Dudley, how many dark deeds could be committed in Altdorf? Man, Hawk is just king at those moves.
And I will say, if you haven't pre-ordered Dark Deeds, a game from Warhammer Legends, you absolutely should. The links for that, I believe, are down in the comments somewhere. If they're not, I'm sure Hawk has posted them like 24 times. Do please follow through. I did a post from the original Rookery page right at the beginning. In fact, I'll do that while you're going through the other questions.
Hawk's going to beat you to it. I don't know why you bother.
No, he might not have the Rookery. He might not have the Rookery link to hand.
Oh, fair. Yeah, please do consider checking out Dark Deeds. Fantastic board game. I'm super excited for those when those ship out.
Yeah, me too.
Because I already bought my copy. Sanguinius the Befouled. This is fun. How much authority do the witch hunters have in a populous city like Altdorf? I imagine most citizens would be terrified of the actions, or horrified, more accurately, by the actions that witch hunters might take to try and root out corruption.
Now, this is a multifaceted question, and actually one that's going to be difficult to summarize in a very short order, because firstly, there are multiple factions of witch hunters, which makes it
they're not a monolith.
Okay, so you've got the witch hunters of Sigmar, and they have multiple versions of where they come from as well, and they have a surprising amount of leeway, particularly in the city of Sigmar itself. But they are, and as much as this may sound ridiculous given what they are ultimately good guys and attempting to fight the right fight. So the fear that many people have for them is significantly less than many might expect. But the rest of them, they're state-sanctioned witch hunters, other cults of witch hunters. There's all sorts of witch hunters that are out there. And think of them a little bit like American-style bounty hunters, in that many of them are chasing bounties. There's a necromancer that's working out of Bog 5. We'll give you some cash if you go down to Bog 5 and drag them in. The state-sanctioned witch hunter will go off with an actual writ granting them power to take that person regardless, and that is where their power is derived from, the paperwork that they hold. Where the witch hunters that are perhaps cult sanctioned, their power often comes from their cult, and that is much less certain much less so, because you might find yourself running into a noble who's like, yeah, no, not on my land. No, just no. Where if you've got a writ from the it's effectively from the prince or some local noble, whoever it is, you can do anything in their lands because you've just been given permission to do so. So you often find that state-sanctioned witch hunters have more power and authority than the Sigmarite ones. The Sigmarite ones who often have to bully their way into getting what they want or persuade their way into getting what they want, who are often right and have things that they need to root out, but are getting stymied by people who don't want to see Sigmar taking away their authority and their power. So it's a complicated state of affairs.
Yeah, there's also a thing that most witch hunters, especially as they get higher up in the rank, they tend to be surprisingly well educated when it comes to law things because they're careful about not overstepping. Because especially for the cults, they don't want them to piss off like the nobility or piss off potential people that are like doing donations or supporting the churches and stuff. So they have to tread carefully.
Yeah, and it's not just they have to tread carefully because they're concerned about their own power and where it comes from. Because if you've read the Witch Hunter novels, you'll notice that they're not exactly the firmest when it comes to having support anyway. There's also the... I'm going to go on a long rant. Let's not do that. Let's just simply say it's complicated and let's have ourselves a nice Witch Hunter episode at a later date because there is a lot to unpack here because the Witch Hunters are freaking awesome.
Yeah. Kev said, are Altdorf regiments the best equipped in the Empire?
No. The Imperial First Regiment of Foot, it's effectively the Imperial Guard. They're a ceremonial unit. Damn straight they're going to be well equipped. But you'll find that each of the Grand Provinces have got their own equivalents. The other Imperial Guard, which is the First Regiment of Foot down in Nuln, they consider themselves to be the true caretakers of the Imperial throne in Nuln. They don't think the one in Altdorf is really the throne at all because Nuln, Magnus's throne, is back in freaking Nuln. So they've got a completely different setup, and they're also extraordinarily well equipped, and they work on behalf of the Countess of Nuln. So the answer is no, they're just one of many. It's easy to say Altdorf is the center of all things, but then you've got to remember that there are many, many, many other factions across the Empire who will want to and seek to outshine Altdorf at any opportunity they can.
Oh boy.
They'll often fail.
Is Altdorf the best large city to live in, or other large cities like Mindenheim or Nuln better places to live? Definitely not Altdorf.
No, Altdorf is a mess. Altdorf is an actual mess. Of all the cities of the Empire, it's one of the ones I will most certainly attempt to avoid. It's filled with magic. The streets themselves you can get lost in by mistake, not because the streets themselves are difficult to navigate, which of course they are. They're twisting and winding like any of the streets are, but because there's so much magic as well to confuse your senses. Mindenheim, at least, is a relatively bigoted at points, but relatively honorable place. It's a place where the gender differences are not necessarily as stark. The Watch has a 50-50 split between men and women, which isn't the case in the good old Reichland Watch. So it's different. Each of the cities have got their own problems. Each of the cities got their own advantages. Hey, I mean, if you like riots, Altdorf's the best place.
Yeah, they all suck for different reasons. I mean, I'll put it bluntly of that. If I was transported to Warhammer World, I'd be getting the fuck out of the Empire real quick.
Yeah, Empire's not a good place.
I'm going somewhere else.
Hey, you're gonna get burned.
Yep. The Wise Ape. What is the relationship between Altdorf and the rest of the Reichland? Are Reichlanders proud of Altdorf, or are they more like those goddamn haughty Altdorfers?
Yeah, there's a significant amount of that, particularly because Altdorf takes all the tax, Altdorf takes all the food, Altdorf takes. If you want an analogy for how it's perceived, I would suggest taking a look at the UK, because it's often the model that is used by writers, particularly if they're British writers, because they know it already. And that's London and the rest of the UK. And the politics in the UK are often, why does London get so much? Why does London get so much? And the wealth needs to be spread outwards. Give it to the rest of us. And you get policies like the Northern Powerhouse that come out from the Conservative Party as they attempt to say, no, we're Conservatives, we'll help the North. And they don't. So broadly speaking, Altdorf is not the great city that is perceived to be. by us on the outside when we just look at it and say, look at all the cool stuff that's there. It'll be great for adventure. If you lived in that world, Altdorf's that gigantic leech taking everything into its heart. And it is a corrupt, bloated heart that's just waiting to explode.
Yeah, good old, if you watch the LAWhammer series, Altdorf for Altdorfers. Second question from him is Altdorf more like a city-state, or does it function more as the actual capital of Reichland?
Both. Both. It used to be entirely a city-state at various points in its histories. Other points, it has been a capital for whatever that means. Capital means different things according to different realms across not just the old world, but in real world as well. But when it comes to the modern version of Altdorf, it is a city-state. It is entirely self-governing, but it is also the capital and where the Prince of Reichland holds his power of all the Reichland. Everyone in the Reichland is sending their taxes to Altdorf. Everyone in the Reichland needs to go to Altdorf if they want to influence Reichland politics. Admittedly, though, it's worth noting that in the Reichland, each of the individual prime estates, that's the nobles that rule the individual duchies and counties, they have almost complete carte blanche to do whatever they want within their individual states. And the only one that doesn't, arguably ironically, is the emperor, who does not have complete control over Altdorf because of a whole host of old laws that were put in place constraining his power over the princedom of Altdorf.
Yep, yeah, because he's the Prince of Reichland, not the Prince, which is quite interesting. Potato salad. What kind of meal would ogres find in Altdorf? Pretty much whatever they want. Altdorf, you'd be able to find anything in Altdorf, even if you know where to look. Soylent Green.
Soylent Green.
Yeah, those sausages they're selling in the Marktplatz are totally not people.
Dubious meat can be found frequently, and ogres in a city of that size, there is so much disposable bodies kicking around that the ogres are going to do just fine. Thanks very much.
Nobody call the Cult of Moor.
And the good old Lowhavens make great use of this because they have cornered the market in criminal ogres.
Yep. What does the Supreme? What is the day-to-day activities for the Supreme Patriarch?
Okay, so the Supreme Patriarch, the chap, assuming it is a chap, who leads the 8 colleges of magic, is responsible for broadly advising the emperor as to magical matters. The leading of the individual colleges is left to each one of the individual matriarchs and patriarchs. They have absolutely no real authority over them. They're leading of their own college because they have so much to do, whether it's dealing with incursions and advising how best to deal with them, speaking to the emperor about magical matters here, there, or whatever, is generally left to some deputy or another. For example, Feuerbach, that's his name. Hans Feuerbach pretty much runs the Bright College during the reign of Thyras Gorman when he was the Supreme Patriarch of the 8 colleges of magic. So it's bluntly advising the emperor and saying how the various wizards can be best used at war. Now, do they have lots of other things to do? Yes. They're constantly talking to the other patriarchs and matriarchs. They're constantly placating, politicking. It's an incredibly powerful position. So imagine any powerful position and you pretty much got it. Meetings after meetings after meetings after soirees after meetings as important decisions are made, and they are then brought down to the rest of the individual colleges.
Yep. One of the things that I think is actually unfortunately very unexplored, which would have been very interesting to explore, would have been the genuine upheaval of when Gelt takes over from Thyras Gorman, and how that would have heavily disrupted Karl Franz's relationship with Gorman and the colleges, because all of a sudden he has this very young Supreme Patriarch and
a foreigner.
Yeah, who's very
okay. So we've got just imagine it. Thyras Gorman and Karl Franz are best mates.
Yeah,
and Thyras Gorman has ruled the colleges of magic for all of Karl Franz's reign, all of it. He has been there from the beginning right up to Gelt coming from literally nowhere, coming in and saying, yeah, it's me now. He's not a noble. He's not from the Empire. He doesn't know Karl Franz. And Thyras is looking on, furious. Moved over to now be just Patriarch of the Bright Order. And yeah, that wasn't explored. And that's loosely, one of the reasons I don't like Gelt, because he's such a character, and it was never explored. He just walked
there's
in and
your
went.
one freebie, chat. There's your one freebie.
So there's one of your freebies. I don't just dislike him for, oh, he did what. I dislike him because he was wasted.
Yep. And in the infamous words of Sienna from Vermintide, Gelt cheated.
Gelt cheated. And you can see just how would Karl Franz respond to that?
Yeah. Oh man, the amount of political turmoil Gelt would have just
it's huge.
It makes him such a fucking
absolutely huge.
Warrington Crescent, Warhammer isn't a reference to real life politics at all. Games Workshop said so. GW's full of shit whenever they say that, because
that whenever I see anything like that, I'm just like shaking my fist, going, "That's absolutely a lie."
Yeah, it is
just not true.
Games Workshop is the equivalent of you remember, have you ever seen those memes where like you see like conservatives go to like the death, what is it, Death of the Machine, that band, there's
Rage Against the Machine. Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah, Rage Against the Machine. They go see that band, they're like, I don't like these guys' political affiliations. Why did they get so political? And it's like,
they were always political.
That's literally Warhammer. It's always been political. Arch Warlock just got here. Colleges of Magic Lorebeards win. We did do one on the Winds of Magic that talks very heavily about the colleges. It's one of the earliest ones that me and Andy did, so go check that out.
Go check that one out. It's a good one. I think if we were ever going to do it, we'd probably be better just grabbing our college at some point, seeing how that goes, because it would be difficult to do any sort of detailed chat. I mean, this chat, for example, about Altdorf has been cursory at best. We've talked about some of the most important institutions. We've talked a little bit about some of the most important characters, but we haven't talked about the district, some of the most important buildings. We haven't made our way through all the various niggly bits of Altdorf. We haven't even discussed at any real length what the difference between the north of Altdorf is and the south. These are some pretty big things, because we have a lot of that detailed, but we can't, because we only have so much time, and there are big things that we need to discuss. So I think if we were to do the Colleges of Magic, we'd be better dropping in on one of them
individual streams
and diving it in. And it also gives us an opportunity to decide whether you like that, and if it goes down really well, we could do another one later, and if it doesn't go down really well, we don't. That was easy.
Yeah, and as a heads up, because it'll never show up on another poll again soon. Whenever we have a result, which I'll try and explain this well, of like an individual magic, like we had Gyran appear on a poll and they did pretty well, but ultimately didn't win. If we talk about an individual win, that would include like the college, which I'll make sure to include that in the notes. Also, Mornington Crest, I did want to call it your best messages. I pulled it up on screen, but forgot to say it out loud. Of the Imperial Dragon is young enough to be rescued by Pedro Pascal, which would make the Mandalorian even better if it was a dragon instead of just a little Yoda. Back to questions. What are the chances of a skink exhibit at the Altdorf Zoo? Actually, surprisingly high. If you consider what the lizardmen are like, there would be pretty hilarious shenanigans involved.
Yeah, that was going to be directly. So in my original plan for what was going to happen with the bestiary book, that was going to happen in there, and it was going to be tied through to one of the small adventures that was, sadly I didn't edit it, so I couldn't properly do it. But one of the adventures, the Affair of the Black Jewel, I think it's called, that was going to be in one of the companion volumes that basically has a lizardman. Well, it's not really a lizard, it's a cold one in it, the lizardy beastie, and they were going to be connected. So yeah, definitely it's something that would definitely occur. Also in that one, we were going to be using Castle Rightguard to house all of the bigger stuff that they really couldn't house in the city, because either it was too dangerous, there wasn't space in the zoo, or some other equivalent. So that Castle Rightguard was going to be holding many of the diplomatic gifts, and they were going to be dropped down there, and there was going to be a tie through to the Imperial Zoological Society down in there as well. So if you want to run with any of that, feel free.
Yep, there you go. Jeff, oh my God, Jeff, so many questions. I will hit as many on these as we can. Okay, so I'm going to just blow through these really, really fast. Is it true in Altdorf there's a heraldry guild that creates heraldry? And if so, in a Discworld reference, is there Guildmaster of Vampire?
No. Yes, there is. There is a body that's mentioned in multiple sources that is responsible for recording every heraldic device in the Empire.
Okay,
and it's in Altdorf.
The Zoo of Altdorf has a lot of crazy creatures on the scale from a Quig to a Dreadsaurian. What would be some of the most rare and exotic creatures the Empire would be able to transport there, and how would they go about doing it? Monster hunters and people that specialize in that, whether they have to resort to taxidermy or if they, but they would usually have wizards with them to try and make it to get the specimens back alive. I mean, the craziest thing they have is the Imperial Dragon. That's pretty fucking crazy to have a dragon.
So I think it's very likely they unwittingly have several mutants, thinking that they are unique creatures from various places that just simply aren't. There's some really good stories about chaos cults infiltrating or doing something that could be tied to that, which I think would be super fun.
Yep. Yeah, they almost would certainly have like mutants or beastmen or other accidental races they don't really know about hanging around in there. How do elves, diplomats, visitors otherwise react to the Imperial Dragon in the zoo? Would Emmerich or the Caldors be surprised or angry? It would depend on what the that would be an interesting thing to explore, because I think it would also kind of depend on what kind of dragon the Imperial Dragon really is, because classifications of dragons became like more and more of a thing as the editions moved onwards. Of like an Ulthwani
dragon.
Yeah, like an Ulthwani breed versus an old world breed, because there are some Black Library books where you'll have the high elves take kind of an approach of like seeing the dragons of the wider world as lesser than the dragons of Ulthwan. Yeah. So it would probably depend on what kind of dragon it is, how old it is, for them to really have much of a reaction. Though Emmerich would probably have a very stereotypically, oh man, these like a noble creature being like lorded over by monkeys. Ugh. But Emmerich's also a massive douche. So
yeah, in the version that I was going to present, they wouldn't even get access.
Yeah,
so they wouldn't know. They just wouldn't know. They just wouldn't let them in. That no one gets in. It's something that's held down there, and only a select few are aware of it.
Yeah, honestly, to be frank, the Imperial Dragon would probably be one of those things that, like Andy said, would be better kept as a secret, because there's just no safe way to show it off. Yeah. You can't, if a dragon decides, like, imagine think about how fucking annoying people are at zoos, right? And like trying to get the animals' attention to bother them, and then put a dragon in that situation. Yeah, no, that's like Altdorf would be burned down. Altdorf is an enormous place with people from all over the world living there, except Skaven, cough under Altdorf. How do these communities have lived in the city for a long time? Oh man, that's so it's like. So it's a big melting pot is the best way I can answer this question of like how everyone works together and what's their opinion and stuff. Altdorf is a very messy place where a lot of people are working towards their own schemes and ambitions. So it's a place where a lot of these other races are drawn to. They probably don't think very highly of Altdorf compared to their homes of origin, especially because it's going to be so different from where they're all from. So they probably are not terribly fond of it, I would imagine, but needs must.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big city like any other. And consider London, New York, any of the great melting pots of the world. What do people think of it? The opinions are as varied as the people that live there.
If a Cathan, an elf, or an ogre were to visit Altdorf for the first time ever and was not a part of those communities, what would they think of the architecture and stuff and those of their kin living in the city? Ogres would probably find it extremely confusing but fascinating. Cathan would probably think it's a disordered mess that is so disharmonious and just horribly planned, and shows that humans need to have dragons over them, making sure things stay ordered. And elves would probably just go, wow, this is a fucking slob fest.
Yeah, I broadly agree, except I think the ogre just wouldn't even notice.
Literally, that would be the more hilarious thing. The ogre would be like...
the ogre is thinking on a completely different level, and looking at buildings and judging them is very far away from how they're thinking. They just fit in, and they don't fit in because they try to fit in. They fit in because they almost ape what's around them. So yeah, but on the other side, absolutely agreed.
Yeah, there's actually probably an interesting joke you could do somewhere of like someone meeting two ogres and thinking they've both been in the city forever, and finding out one has been there forever and the other one's only been there for like 3 days. But because he's an ogre, he just fits right in. Question for Andy: how many gnomes would there be in Altdorf? Would they go there, or would they much rather avoid it due to the colleges and temples there that one might be more inclined to hunt them?
No, gnomes are itinerant, and assuming you're going with the version that's sitting inside Rough Night Hard Days, and assuming you're going with the size of the city that we were pinning down, so we're talking proper Constantinople or Rome of the old world, it is the biggest city. If you're going for that sort of size, there's hundreds. There's not a small number. There's hundreds. And of those, about maybe 100 or so are itinerant ones from Glimdwaro, and the rest of them are for completely different gnomish communities from around the Empire and possibly beyond. Some of them from Albion or elsewhere. It's a melting pot. It has everybody there.
Okay, this one's very easy to answer. In the Discworld series, there's something called background magic around the Unseen University of Wizards, which causes a lot of shenanigans, like talking animals, all sorts of weird phenomena around the magic or that place. Is the same thing with the colleges of magic. Do they?
To a degree,
yeah. The colleges of magic have supernatural phenomena. It's relatively well contained, but yeah, it gets out all the time.
Yeah,
and it causes
things
problems.
go wrong. Yeah, it does. It causes problems.
Altdorf being Altdorf, suppose that vampires will be present, especially LAWmians. Are there countermeasures in place within Altdorf? Yes, and if so, how would vampires avoid or bypass? LAWmians in particular are very good at blending in. Like some of the high society and nobles of Altdorf are literally just LAWmians. And there's even a LAWmian who is protected by Karl Franz that lives in Altdorf because she saved his life once, that being Genevieve. Which causes a fair number of problems with the people that know about her. But yeah, no, vampires.
She's got a writ. Yeah, I broadly agree. Vampires there, yes. Do they have to be careful? Yes.
I would say you have to think that the LAWmians, at the end of the day, are probably the ones influencing the measures they'll take against vampires. But at the same time, the LAWmians want to keep out the other bloodlines. They don't want the other vampires there. So the
anti-vampire measures are absolutely essential. They just have to be essential in a way that doesn't target them. So yeah, completely. Cut a long story short, they're everywhere.
Yep. In the Thankful series, it said the Skaven under Altdorf have slowly realized that rising up to claim all the surface would be less convenient from them just manipulating, stealing from the shadows. How accurate is this to current lore and for Skaven? I'd say it depends on the.
It's as good an answer as any. The Skaven are a multifaceted species.
It just depends.
Yeah,
I think for under Altdorf though, that's a very accurate position for them to feel. Is that they would be one of the, because under Altdorf kind of gets in trouble in the book from the Council of 13's perspective because they get complacent. And they're less interested in like inheriting the world, more like, we have a good thing going. We're fucking rich. Let's just keep this going. And it pisses the Council of 13 off to no end. Because they're not doing what they're told, which is why when Thankful does what he does to under Altdorf, mostly by accident, the Council of 13 isn't that pissed about it. I've heard the colleges of engineering established in Altdorf were founded by the same man that designed the steam tank. Why did he choose to do this in Altdorf as opposed to any other city?
Because the Empire had an army and Tilia didn't in Warhammer.
Yep, and they probably paid him an obscene amount of money.
And thus, we then have to justify it as writers as to why that happened. The real reason is because we had an Empire army, and the Empire army was at the forefront. There was not going to be a Tilian army. There wasn't going to be any, but they wanted to have their Michelangelo equivalent. They wanted their steam tanks to have that heritage. So the real reason is because they were selling an Empire army. The in-game reason is because money and the open-mindedness that apparently the Empire offers, which does stand contrary to what the Cult of Sigmar does in comparison to the Cult of Myrmidia, but that is still the answer that they currently go with. I'm sure that through the course of the Old World, at least I hope through the course of the Old World, they'll dive into that at least with a paragraph or two to provide some extra context, because as it currently stands, it's sitting on very thin ice in terms of being a realistic answer.
Yeah, if there's a character that is talked about a lot, but is criminally underexplored, it's Leonardo de Miragliano.
He's used a little bit in the Thousand Thrones as well. Yeah, particularly with all the conspiracies he's involved with, and it ties directly through to Nagash as well, and the whole concept of ascension. So as a character, he was into a lot.
Yeah, there's actually a really fascinating short story about him as well, which is probably referencing that talks about his relationship with some vampires down in Talea. So like he's got a whole bunch of interesting shit going on. Like he really kind of deserves his own like novel because he's such a fascinating character. He's one of those instances where I think Games Workshop relies a little too heavily on his like real world counterpart to be like, oh, you could just infer what you know about him from Leonardo da Vinci, but that's not really a satisfactory answer because he's more complicated than that. So stop being lazy, GW. Come on. How big is Myrmidian's influence in Altdorf compared to other places? Like, are there soldiers jogging through the streets in the morning?
That's not influence, that's just soldiers. And if you're meaning the state soldiers of the empire, yeah, they're not doing that. The influence of Myrmidia is only really amongst the ruling aristocracy. And that's, you're talking the commissioned officers of the state army. And even there is relatively low. It's not a very high, as at least as it currently stands, influence. So there are some individuals who are thoroughly, let's say, enraptured by Myrmidian ways of dealing with things, but they don't really consider themselves Myrmidians. They're just good soldiers, and they've listened to the good sense that the various Myrmidian teachings offer. You got to remember, this is a polytheistic world. This is a world that is not, we're all Sigmarites. They're not. They're just people, and there's gods out there who all have got their own opinions, and they'll listen to some of them according to the situation that they're currently in. In terms of overall influence, though, pretty freaking low. Although there are obviously orders like the Knights of the Blazing Sun or the various Knights of the, oh, there's so many different names for the Knights of the Shining Spear in the very ways it pops up, righteous spear, this, that, and the other, but it's all the same order. And not big.
Yeah,
they're there.
Yeah, especially because like the cult of Sigmar kind of jealously guards the seat of power, because they're keenly aware of the fact that they don't want, they have a lot of power because of all their electric count seats and stuff, and they don't need a strong rival in Altdorf.
Yeah.
How do the wizards of the colleges deal with citizens of? What do the wizards? That's actually a really funny question. What kind of nonsense do the wizards of the colleges of magics covertly sell to civilians? And what kind of market have civilians made back with wizards? So, like, what kind of underground market is there between the colleges and civilians of the Altdorf?
So, yeah, this is a fascinating question. Is one that is, I think, massively underserved, because we have got ourselves basically living weapons of war. Do not think of the wizards as people, because that's not how some perceive them. Think of them like giant machine guns. Think of them like missiles to be pointed. And that's how some of the nobles perceive them. And obviously, they're real people with their own wants and their own needs. And they're bound by the colleges of magic. And the colleges of magic, they get a license. And in the articles of magic, which is the laws they have to work by, they have to respond to any call of war, and at the elector counts in particular. And they are forbidden from doing tons of stuff that they will almost all certainly do. Anyone who has played the role-playing game breaks the articles of magic the second the wizard casts their first spell, almost every single time, because the article of magic are super tight about when you can and can't use magic. And civilians are always looking for it. Rich merchants are going to be looking for support in a variety of things. Rich nobles are going to be looking for support that lies well beyond the remit of what the articles of magic allow. Will wizards be doing this? Yes. And I would argue that of all the colleges, the one that's doing it least is probably, now individuals are going to contradict this all over the place, but the Grey College, the one that you think might be doing it most, because they are the one that are the most careful when it comes to recruitment, because it is essential that the Grey Wizard is above and beyond reproach. They have to be. And those who come to their Grey Wind late are the worst examples of it. For example, Emmanuel Hoswine Schlichten, who came to the magic
and or uncle of Karl Franz. Yeah,
indeed. He who was originally written to be brother, but was later made an uncle. But I think that works well for the Grey College anyway.
Yep. Okay. I'm gonna blow through these. Jeff, your question about Skaven and bells. Skaven do not have a necessarily intrinsic relationship with bells. It has to involve Warpstone and other runes of the Skaven. They can't just pick up a random bell and make it Greenhorn Rat affiliated. And then what would the Lizardmen think of Altdorf and all the stuff going on there? The Lizardmen would fucking hate it. They would see it as disordered chaos, and they would think it probably needs to be burned to the ground, and humans need to be taught their proper place. Mazda Money would blow up Altdorf so fast.
Unless it's part of the Great Plan.
Yeah,
but, that's the big thing with the Lizardmen, and it's always worth keeping in your mind. Yeah. Every time that you've got an opinion, you then have the golden plaque that says they do nothing. So
I will say, from a person living in Altdorf's perspective, the Lizardmen showing up would probably not be a pleasant event. Because the Lizardmen would probably see a lot of problems that need fixing. And there would be debates among the Slann. It would be a mess. But that's why it's good they don't come over there very often. I'll put it this way. The one time the Lizardmen appeared in the Empire randomly was a storm of magic accidentally summoned a bunch of Lizardmen outside Averheim, and the Lizardmen immediately attacked the city. But maybe that was part of the plan. Maybe there was a plaque saying they needed to. Who can say? Bahamut's boy, is Altdorf an abbreviation for alternate dwarf? I don't think so, but that's a fun theory.
No.
I want to make a PC that's like their whole, like they have that a conspiracy theory. Humans are just alternate dwarfs, where they're not technically wrong, but Surrogate Gaia, meta question involving the magic Wolfrup. Do we know the reason for the change to college's magic? It's just due to confusion and authors taking different interpretations. We talked about that earlier. We talked about maps and that they're not really that helpful because they're all kind of a mess. Would Karl Franz eat Deathclaw if he was starving? That's a weird question. I feel like that's the thing that like one of Karl Franz's friends.
Good luck, Karl Franz.
What? Yeah, no, he would get eaten by Deathclaw first, if anything. But I mean, that being said, like Deathclaw is like horrifically loyal, so who knows? That's a weird question. That's like asking, would you eat your dog if you were hungry? I think Karl Franz would rather die. Especially if you go with the idea that's presented in some books where Karl Franz is literally raised Deathclaw from a chick. Yeah, no, I think he would literally rather die than kill Deathclaw himself. Because he probably loves Deathclaw very dearly. Both the yeah, okay, we've already answered these. We've already answered a lot of these. We've answered those. We've answered those. Altdorf is I don't believe Altdorf has ever been successfully sacked by like an enemy race. Like it's been like switched hands from like human owners. But
yeah,
to my knowledge, it's never been sacked.
Yeah, I think in reality, almost certainly has been, but no one's had the balls to do it in text.
Yeah, like over the thousands of years, it seems very unlikely, especially when it wasn't what it is now, that it would have gotten its ass handed to it plenty of
multiple times, particularly during its first few years, particularly as well when it was Reitdorf rather than, you could argue Altdorf from 1000 to 1500 hasn't, but even then I would suggest that it probably has been during the Dark Ages at some point.
Yeah, there's no, it had not got, in my opinion, I think it would have almost been certainly been sacked by Bretonnians at some point. Probably would have been sacked by Greenskins, maybe back in the early days. Like there's probably been all sorts of shenanigans.
Yeah, it's a little bit like saying, you know, the White House has never been burnt down, but it has.
What's the density of guards in Altdorf? Like, how likely would a PC be to run into a guard on a regular basis?
Depends where you are in the city. It's such a huge place. Some places are exceedingly well patrolled. Others never see a guard pretty much ever. So it depends where you are in the city.
Okay, looking at how long we've been streaming and the time at this point, unfortunately, I'm going to switch to wrapping up super chats. If you have any remaining questions, I will do my best to pass those along to Andy so he can hopefully get you an answer, or I'll answer them myself, one of the two. So we will hit those up, and let me just wrap these up here. Altdorf Part 2, certainly possible in the future. Though if we were to do that, it would probably be like we kind of talked about with colleges. Okay. We would probably do it focused on a specific concept as opposed to just Altdorf Part 2.
I think so too.
This is to whet your appetite for more Altdorf stuff.
Yeah, totally. There's a host of subjects in Warhammer where there has been a ton of work done, and this is one of them. Meaning that we just can't really do it justice with a single stream. So there'll be something, but it'll probably be focused on an individual point.
Also, for Total War Warhammer 3 Part 2, can't wait for Cathay and Taurus. I assume you mean the reaction stream, and yes, I'm very excited for that as well. The Cathay trailer.
I'm really looking forward to that.
A lot of interesting things to say. Lord Sarthinius finally caught a live Lorebeards. Well, welcome. So glad you could make it. Love you guys. You guys have been keeping me company throughout my job. I had my AirPods under my bandana and listened to the whole lore. hopefully,
brilliant.
Situational hearing, but that's awesome.
Riding on a motorbike. Oops. Yeah, I hope that's not the case.
Michael 7382. Would the colleges basically be individual military branches, and the Supreme Patriarch is basically a Supreme Allied Commander to advise the Emperor?
Yes, that's a good way of viewing it. It's obviously not entirely analogous, but it's a really good way of viewing it. Yeah, good.
Sean Schultz, longest time that the city has not been on fire.
I'd say at least 2 days.
Yeah, there's definitely a number of days since last incident in the Bright College, and it's they probably only use single digits. Hammond, they French cannot count. You ask for trois rolls and they give you
Give
three.
you 3. Un, deux, trois.
I stole a kilt and I pled guilty. Hammond's
Dude!
Hammond's just rushing him in here at the end. I met the godfather of the Scottish Mafia earlier. He made me an offer I couldn't understand.
I mean, that seems fair.
I like that one. That's actually really funny.
I resemble that remark.
That's super funny. Ricky Chapman, there are probably lizardmen pretending to be animals in the zoo to spy on the city. That would be kind of a fun concept, but unlikely.
I mean, it's super unlikely because why? What's there to spy on? And
keep in mind, the lizardmen are like some of the most powerful wizards in the setting. They could just scry the city. They have they have much more convenient means. The slung can astral project. They can just watch it. Some of them probably do. They've got other ways. So that is it for the stream on Altdorf. We hope you all enjoyed it. I'm going to let Andy do his usual wrap up here in a second. But before he does that, I do want to couple quick notes that the vote going into next week on Andy's channel is going to be a little different. I'm just going to spring this on Andy and hopefully he'll be okay with it.
Okay, let's find out.
Because of all the excitement around Thrones of Decay, what we're going to do to make it a little more interesting for the next 3 weeks is instead of just doing like a Thrones of Decay stream, which I don't think we're going to have enough time for, I'm going to split it into, we're going to let y'all vote on Empire, Nurgle, and Dwarfs. And whichever wins is the one we'll do first. Then the second one we'll do second. And then the last one we'll do third. And we will basically talk about that faction, all the changes and updates that come into them and where those came from and their inspirations and such. So the next 3 weeks will be super fun, awesome shit that y'all should hopefully be really excited for.
Yeah, that'll be super fun. I'm quite looking forward to that because I've been paying attention, believe it or not, over the course of the last few weeks as all the various updates have been coming out. And some of it's just made me go, ooh. Right, so we have finished Altdorf. What did we learn? We learned that Altdorf is an ancient city, which is, I think, appropriate for a town that's effectively called Old Town. Some beautifully original naming there. It is the center of imperial politics, but unlike what most people believe, particularly if you come from, say, just a total war background, the emperor himself has very little direct control and authority over not just the city, but the empire as a whole. Instead, it's all of the politicians that live and work and breathe in that city, all of whom are pulling and tugging in different directions. It's a place where we have the colleges of magic. It's a place where we have the great Guild of Engineers. It's a place where we have some of the most impressive institutes of learning, not just in the old world, but in the world as a whole. And it is also freaking huge, or it's not, or it's small, or it's a medieval town, or it's bigger than Rome and Constantinople could ever be, or it's not. It's a city of massive contradictions, which, for the home of the Colleges of Magic, makes a great deal of sense, particularly if you go to Spires of Altdorf, a book that was written for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, where they said, you know, the map we made is bullshit. We know it's bullshit because all the people that are inside the town can't map it. They literally can't because of the Colleges of Magic and everything that occurs there. So basically, the way you make your way through the town isn't using a map, it's by landmarks. And you say, oh, it's just past that particular tower. Or you go down that street, you go over that hill. Just make sure you stick to the main road and don't take any diversions. Because Altdorf is a place that no one can really know because at its heart, it is a tool. It is something that Games Workshop deploys whenever they need to change their setting one more time in a slightly different direction. And it is also at the very heart of their most important faction. Now, you might think that the dwarves or the elves or Cathay or whatever else is the most important faction, but it isn't. All of the novels have broken out from the heart that is the Empire. And at the heart of that Empire is Altdorf itself. There are more stories, more books, more characters that are tied to that place than any other that exists. And that is why it is a place of deep and abiding contradiction, because so many bloody authors have come in and made it their own, which for the individual stories is brilliant. But for people like Sotek and I, it's not just a headache, it's an absolute bloody nightmare because it completely contradicts itself from top to bottom. This great city of islands that is actually has no islands. You what now? How does that make any sense? So to completely end all of this, I would ask if you are following through the links that were posted earlier, and if you happen to have any books with sources about Altdorf, I'm intending on making a map of the place for the bigger version of it. What it would be like if it was a city that was bigger than Constantinople. And I'm not going to do that unless I have all the sources to hand. So if you'd like to see that map being made, go follow those links. They'll be popped down in the comments or in the video description.
The comment and the description. It'll be both.
At some point later, we'll have I have a Discord thread already opened for it, and we have a spreadsheet available online. The instructions are in that spreadsheet online right now. And if you have even just one book for Warhammer, take a look through it, find the Altdorf references, mark it into that spreadsheet, and once we've got them all done, I will build it. Beyond that, buy Dark Deeds, because Dark Deeds is brilliant and is on pre-order now.
Man, I was sitting here like with such a clever segue, and then you just come out and ruin it. Jesus, come on.
I'm sorry.
No tact.
No tact at all.
Lord Sarthenius, I do have situational hearing. I only use one AirPod. Andy gave me a clap and Sotek pronounced my name right. Ah, there you go. And CP4N, and of course, we learned Krimlo has cornered the housing market. Yeah, because he's an evil bastard.
That Krimlo.
Just let the people have houses. All right. And Morgan Kristen, thank you for the last second bits of Altdorf, the city of bloody nightmares. Yeah, because, you know, it's not totally that all those bizarre retcons and stuff are actually canonical, because there's something lurking at the center of Altdorf.
There's something lurking in center. Watch LAWhammer.
Yeah, genuinely, if you're like, are they being serious? We're being dead serious. There is something at the center of Altdorf that is horrifying. Go watch LAWhammer and you'll figure out what it is. It's great. Thank you all again for watching, and we will see you on Wednesday night here at 6 p.m. CST, midnight your time?
Midnight UK time.
For part 2 of reaction goodies, and then we'll have more stuff coming in the weeks ahead. So we'll see you then. Take care, and
until then,
bye-bye.